Chapter 23-29. Zhang Yan believed that even though the creation spirit had attached itself to the Weili of the two patriarchs and was able to maintain its existence, he was still using the tribulation power to oppress the creation spirit. As a result, the creation spirit's current situation was not much better than when it was sealed by the tribulation power. Without a doubt, this was their chance. Because of the obstruction of the tribulation power, the creation spirit's reaction to their actions was very slow. Just now, when the two patriarchs were searching for the creation chi, the creation spirit didn't notice them at all. However, he believed that the creation spirit wouldn't just fall into a predicament like this. The creation spirit definitely had more tricks up its sleeves. After thinking about it, he called out in his heart and invited the two ancestors into the divine will. He told the two of them about the calculations and thoughts he had just made. After listening, the two patriarchs believed that his deduction was correct. Patriarch Yao Han said, "From what fellow Taoists said, if we want to retrieve the creation chi, we only need to break the Weili connection between us and the creation spirit." Zhang Yan said, "That's right. However, the creation chi was first used by the creation spirit, so its understanding of this chi is much greater than mine. Therefore, I believe that even if I don't do anything, it will not take long for the creation chi to be retrieved. If we want to do anything, we have to do it before it does." Patriarch Yao Han sighed. This matter is both easy and difficult. Zhang Yan knew what he meant. The simplest method was to put the two patriarchs in silence. However, this might be what the creation spirit wanted, so he didn't approve of this method. There was another method that was easier, and that was to place a chess piece on the Grand Tao chessboard. After all, the Grand Tao chessboard was created by the creation spirit and the virtuous virtues. Other than the creation spirit's Weili connection, there was also the virtuous virtues power. With a turn of the chessboard, it could borrow the power of Tao to move the entire Grand Tao. Although it was only a slight shift, a single strand of creation chi couldn't be stopped. However, this way, the chess momentum they had accumulated on the chessboard would be broken, and the advantage they had against the enemy would no longer exist. This also affected his subsequent actions, so it was not advisable to stop a strand of creation chi. Therefore, they had to think of a way outside the chessboard. At this moment, Patriarch Hongba said, "I've already calculated it. If I slash it with my sword, I can temporarily sever the chi dynamic. Will the chi of creation reveal its true form?" Zhang Yan thought for a moment and said, "I'm afraid that won't be of any use." The end determined by the creation chi was determined by the master's mind, and it was also determined by the creation spirit. Even if the connection was broken due to other external factors, as long as it could still be connected, it meant that the true end had not appeared, and the chi wouldn't reveal itself. Patriarch Yao Han thought for a moment and said, "If I use the art of transformation, I can break away from the control of the original chi. What do you think, fellow Taoist?" Hearing his words, Zhang Yan thought for a moment and immediately understood what he meant. Patriarch Yao Han had a divine art that could change his current self into his other self. Furthermore, when he transformed, he would transform into a completely different person. He wasn't just a clone. It was similar to the good fortune spirits and the bodies that had reincarnated into the world. However, Patriarch Bright Han's clones weren't divided into primary and secondary. The one with the highest cultivation base would be the true body. Therefore, the Patriarch Yao Han he saw now might not be the first Patriarch Yao Han. The incarnations of Yu Lu, Yu Qiu, and even Patriarch Yao Han's Weili were the same. If Yu Lu or Yu Qiu had a higher cultivation than the one sitting in front of him, then that person would be Patriarch Yao Han. The reason why he did this was to find a trace of heaven's secret. After all, the power of everyone was better than the power of one. And because he had changed into his Tao body, the Weili's aura was completely different from before. He was a completely different person, and from this point of view, the creation chi wouldn't be able to affect him. Zhang Yan said, "Fellow Taoist, could you use this method on your fellow Taoist?" Patriarch Yao Han smiled and said, "If my fellow Taoist is unwilling, then I can't do anything. But if he agrees, then it won't be difficult to use it." Zhang Yan nodded. This method seemed to be feasible, but once it was used, there would be no turning back. He couldn't be sure, so he said, Let me calculate again. At his level of cultivation, he didn't need Patriarch Yao Han to display his Taoist arts to know what was going on. Thus, after some calculations in his mind, he said, "This method still won't work. The person the spirit of creation recognizes is fellow Taoist Yao Han's true self. No matter how your Taoist body changes, as long as your true self doesn't change, you won't be able to break the connection." The creation spirit didn't care about the appearance, aura, or Weili of a great virtue. It only recognized the root, or Tao name. Therefore, no matter how it changes, as long as the true self doesn't change, it won't be able to escape from this qi. Patriarch Yao Han felt that it was a pity, but he wasn't too disappointed. He said, "Now it seems that if we want to sever the connection, we will have to pay a great price, or we won't be able to avoid it. But since we know the secret, we don't have to act before the creation spirit does." Zhang Yan nodded. He had also considered this before. Since the two ancestral masters did not have a good way to act first, they could only wait for the creation spirit to free itself and the creation qi to reappear. Then they could fight for it. He said, "Once the Weili connection is severed, the creation spirit will fall into silence. Therefore, it will try to find a way to protect itself before doing this. But I don't think it will place a chess piece on the chessboard." The two ancestral masters also expressed their agreement. The creation spirit would rather use the creation qi than place a chess piece on the chessboard. Therefore, it wouldn't use such a method in the future. Ancestor Yao Han thought for a moment and said, "If the creation spirit has another source of creation qi in its hand, would it be able to free itself?" Zhang Yan said, "Just now, I have calculated that the creation qi can't interfere with the same thing. Fellow Taoists, you don't need to worry about this. But since the creation qi is in all beings, the creation spirit will definitely try to sever its connection with all beings. Otherwise, it won't be able to take it back." Patriarch Yao Han said, "Fellow Taoist is right. It seems that this fellow's next move will be in all beings no matter what method he uses. Then I'll just wait." After discussing with the two patriarchs, Zhang Yan silently waited on the chessboard. But he didn't relax his suppression on the creation spirit. Tribulation power continued to press down on it, trying his best to isolate it from the outside world. After waiting for a long time, the creation spirit finally moved. A ray of light shot out, piercing through the tribulation power and landing in all beings. In an instant, a present world appeared. At the same time, a Weili energy separated from its body and immersed itself in this world. At this moment, Zhang Yan felt the same mysterious feeling as last time. This was clearly the creation spirit releasing another creation qi. At the same time, he saw the creation spirit's intention. It first opened up the present world and then split a part of its power to create a spirit to bind itself. Although the previous worlds merged under the influence of the Great Tao, this was only the fusion of the land of creation and the present world. Now that the creation spirit used the creation qi to materialize the present world, it was no longer part of this. Originally, if the present world didn't have a land of creation attached to it, then it would be destroyed in an instant in the eyes of those who had transcended the present world. But because it was created by the creation qi, it wouldn't disappear until it died on its own. It could be said that the creation qi had replaced the role of the land of creation. Not only that, but it had also become an indestructible land. Unless one could use a power above it, such as the power of the chessboard of the Great Tao, to break it. Zhang Yan smiled at this moment. Although this world appeared to be indestructible from the outside, it was not without loopholes. If the spirit born inside cultivated to a high level and then killed the spirit that the spirit of creation had placed in this world, it could destroy the spirit of creation's arrangements. The two patriarchs saw this loophole as well. Founding Master Hongba said coldly, "This place is strong on the outside but weak on the inside. As long as we can bring our Tao into this world and let the inheritor of the Tao kill the spirit that the spirit of creation has placed in this world, we will be able to undo the connection and beat it back to its original state." Patriarch Yao Han laughed and sighed. "Even if we don't fight the creation spirit, we still need to use the living beings in the present world." Hongba said seriously, "Under the Great Tao, there is no distinction of nobility or inferiority. Being broad and tolerant is the right way. If one blindly looks up, they might not be able to see the true fruit of the great Tao. Zhang Yan agreed with this view. In the modern world, many powerful cultivators felt that they were superior after cultivating to a high realm. This was because they could control the life and death of all living beings in the lower levels at will. But they forgot that they were under the rules of the great Tao like these lowly beings. If there came a day when the rules of the great Tao believed that the living beings below them could control their life and death, then everything would be reversed. Of course, if that was really the case, there would need to be a logical change, otherwise the rules would fall into chaos. But fundamentally speaking, there was no difference between the two. Only by completely mastering the rules of the great Tao or not being bound by it could one truly transcend just now. But no one, including the Vedanta and the creation spirit, had been able to do this. But they were all moving in this direction, so this battle could be seen as a battle for control of the great Tao. As for the battle for the great Tao, everything was involved. Sometimes, the variables in the lower levels could affect the outcome of the battle at the upper levels, so it was not strange. Zhang Yan glanced at it. The creation spirit now had another connection with everything. Perhaps it would soon cut off its Whaley connection with the two patriarchs and take the creation chi back. They would not let it happen, but now it was not just one strand of creation chi that needed to be considered, but two. Please remember this book's domain name. 9 Heavens Xinhuang Mobile Reading Site. Chapter 23:30. Zhang Yan pondered for a while. Just now, the wisp of qi of creation that the spirit of creation used would definitely fall into the omnipresence after the transformation. As for where it would fall, based on his previous calculations, it was hard to say whether the spirit of creation could exert a weak influence on it. He still had to investigate further. However, finding this wisp of qi was not the most urgent matter at hand. It was obvious that unless this present world collapsed, this qi would not appear. They still had plenty of time to search for it. What they needed to do first was to find the first wisp of qi of creation and prevent the spirit of creation from retrieving it. Apart from these, there was another matter that was equally important and needed to be arranged first. He transmitted his divine will to the two patriarchs and said, "That is the present world created by the spirit of creation. We need to transmit our Tao into it as soon as possible so that the living beings in this world can fight against the spirit created by the spirit of creation. If we are one step late and the Tao transmission of the spirit of creation takes over, this place will really be unbreakable." Although they could not enter this present world themselves, fortunately, their Tao transmission could use the collision of the Whaley to seep into it and affect the living beings in it. As the saying goes, clear qi turns into human, turbid qi turns into demon. All living beings are formed from qi. As long as there is a present world, it will definitely evolve into a myriad of worlds. As long as there is a boundary, there will definitely be living beings. This was determined by the rules of the great Tao. Even the spirit of creation could not go against it. Patriarch Yao Han said, "Since the spirit of creation has been linked, it will definitely break the link between our mana and qi to find the qi of creation." Fellow Taoist Xian Yuan, why don't we split up to prevent any mistakes? Zhang Yan nodded and said, "All right, let's do it this way." He immediately guided the Whaley that the two had sent over and gathered it with his own Whaley. Then, he pointed with his finger and caused it to collide with the present world. This present world was formed by the qi of creation. It was neither damaged nor destroyed. However, it was controlled by the spirit of creation, so it was naturally filled with the spirit of creation's Whaley. When the two of them collided, there was naturally a Tao technique transmitted. The spirit of creation could ignore this, but the Tao legacy of Zhang Yan and the other two naturally transmitted into this world. It wasn't difficult for the spirit of creation to see through the intentions of Zhang Yan and the others. However, this was an overt plot that no one could stop. At this time, the person saw that there was already a living creature in the world, so he pushed the spirit he had created into the world, allowing it to reincarnate. Originally, this spirit was used by him to guide himself. As for whether or not the spirit itself entered the world, it was not important. In fact, it was even better if it did not enter the world. This way, outsiders would not be able to find it, and it would be one with the world. It could be said that it was impenetrable from the inside out, and no one could do anything to him. However, the problem was that even if this spirit did not enter the world, it must have the possibility to enter the world and become a human. Otherwise, this spirit would be no different from him in terms of origin. Only by separating from him in terms of the Wei Qi activity could it bear the heavy responsibility of binding him within everything. Now that Zhang Yan and the others had imparted their Tao into this world, if an ordinary living being were to receive this Tao imparting, then after cultivating to a certain level, they might be able to find the location of the spirit and force it to enter the world, then erase it. Instead of that, it would be better to directly send it into the world to reincarnate and achieve it before those ordinary living creatures. If it was possible, they could even break the path of cultivation of all living creatures. In this way, they could stabilize this existence. Zhang Yan also knew that the spirit of creation currently had the home advantage, and the spirit it built was separated from its original body. Therefore, once it entered the path of cultivation, it would definitely improve extremely quickly. It could completely be seen as a body of the spirit of creation. If ordinary living creatures were to compete with such an existence, if they ignored everything else, there was almost nothing they could compare to. However, it was not that there was no chance here. Because the worlds that were formed in the world were endless and boundless, so as long as the spirit did not cultivate to the spirit refinement realm, there would always be places that it could not take care of. However, the spirit of creation would at most allow it to reach the true yang realm. It was impossible for it to go any higher. This was because after it transcended the world, once it was enlightened, it might be separated from its original body and walk on the old path of dividing the power of its original body. However, no matter what, in a contest in the world, the spirit of creation had too great of an advantage. Moreover, once it succeeded once, the possibility of success for them to open up a new situation would become extremely slim. Therefore, he needed to use some additional methods to cause some trouble for the spirit. With a thought, he sent a sliver of tribulation power into it. After he gained control of the tribulation power, the changes of the various tribulations were under his control. Since the world had been established, it would definitely conform to the rules of the Great Tao. It could tolerate the arrival of any Tao technique, because these Tao techniques were contained within the Great Tao. However, although these Tao techniques existed, they were too far away. Ordinary living creatures who were not cultivators would find it difficult to come into contact with them. However, the tribulation power was different. It could be as big as the destruction of the world and everything, as small as tsunamis, landslides, wind, rain, thunder, and lightning. There were also the obstacles and tribulations on the path of cultivation for cultivators. These could all be considered as tribulation power. He was the person who had grasped this Tao technique, so he could consciously pour it into the spirit. This way, he could delay the spirit's steps of attaining Tao, preventing it from easily climbing to the upper realm. However, in this way, the living creatures of the human path would also be affected as they cultivated. However, there were countless living creatures of the human path, but there was only one spirit that the spirit of creation had built. Even if there were billions of people fighting against one person, there was still a higher chance of victory. On the other side, Patriarch Yao Han and Patriarch Hong Ho knew that the spirit of creation would definitely cut off its connection with them so that the Qi of creation would appear. Therefore, they were waiting for this moment with rapt attention. Before long, the two of them felt their senses lighten. The Wei that the spirit of creation had collided with had quietly retreated. At the same time, the two of them saw a mysterious aura appear out of nowhere where the hole that represented the Qi of creation had originally been. At this moment, the spirit of creation's Wei was probing into everything. Patriarch Hong Ho's eyes sharpened. He pressed his fingers together and waved. A ray of sword light swiftly slashed down. It cut through all the Qi and struck the Wei of the spirit of creation. Although the spirit of creation was now connected to the present world, under the influence of the tribulation power, it could only prevent itself from falling into silence. The changes in the Wei were greatly affected. However, no matter how weakened it was, the only great virtue that could face it head-on was Zhang Yan. Therefore, Patriarch Hongho's sword strike was not to completely sever the Weili, but to delay it slightly. Patriarch Yao Han did not look over at all. Instead, he took the opportunity to capture the qi of creation. However, at this moment, his expression was extremely cautious. Although he had seen this qi after the essence of creation shattered, it was difficult to know if there would be any changes after the spirit of creation used it once. If he rashly took it, it would be a small matter if he was only injured. However, if the spirit of creation took back the qi because of this, not only would he fail the trust of his fellow Taoists, but the battle would also be greatly affected. He slowly sent his Weili into it. However, as soon as it came into contact with the qi, he felt his spirit tremble. Then, many mysteries of the great Tao were transmitted into him. At this moment, he had a feeling that this qi could turn into a machine according to his will. If he wanted to seek the great Tao, then this qi could drive him in that direction. Moreover, this was not an illusion. There was a certain chance of success. This was because this qi could directly guide people into the heavenly secrets of achieving the Tao. Originally, the heavenly secrets were unfathomable, but by relying on this qi, it could point you in the right direction. It could be said that any cultivator would be tempted if they knew there was such an opportunity. Patriarch Yao Han was no exception. However, he shook his head and smiled. He was not tempted by this. If it was so easy to obtain the Tao, why would Tai Ming need to gather the power of the great virtue to seal the spirit of creation? Why would the spirit of creation fight with them? Wouldn't it be better to directly seek the great Tao? There was definitely something he could not see through at the moment. As a result, he didn't do anything superfluous. Instead, he prepared to collect the qi. However, when he did so, he found that the qi was extremely heavy. He understood that it wasn't really heavy, but that it had exceeded the limit of his Weili. If he collected it now, he would only be able to collect most of it and leave the rest here. However, if he did so, he wouldn't be able to complete the great Tao. This was clearly not in line with their original intentions. With a thought, a person who looked exactly like him appeared next to his Taoist body. The two of them exerted their strength at the same time and collected the qi activity together. The spirit of creation sensed the change here. He clearly didn't want to lose this strand of qi. After breaking through Patriarch Hong He's obstruction, the Weili immediately chased after Patriarch Yao Han. At this moment, a large hand made of Xian qi reached out from the void. With a gentle press, the Weili was forcibly suppressed. The spirit of creation Weili seemed to know that it was impossible, so he didn't continue to stay here and retreated. Zhang Yan turned to look at the two patriarchs Yao Han. Both of them were ordinary in terms of qi dynamic and mighty force, and it could be said that there was no difference between the real and the fake. Both of them were Yao Han himself, and he knew that this should be a transformation of the Tao that this person practiced, so he didn't ask much. He just followed the person's instructions and easily received the qi of creation. He examined it and found that the use of this qi was very consistent with his previous calculations. However, if he wanted this qi to be of great use, he first had to collect enough qi and then he had to pay a corresponding amount of power to control it. Otherwise, no matter how much creation qi you possessed, you could only use it separately, and 1 or 2 wisps of creation qi wouldn't be able to pose much of a threat to your opponent. It was no wonder that the spirit of creation could only use this qi on itself and not on other critical areas. On top of that, he'd also sensed the profundities of the Grand Tao. However, he'd merely smiled and didn't take it seriously. Because he could see at a glance that this qi might really be able to do this, but his own power hadn't reached the level of seeing the great Tao, so it would only be assimilated by the great Tao. It should be known that the ultimate goal of a cultivator to pursue the great Tao was to control or transcend the great Tao, not to lose control after integrating with the great Tao. There was no shortcut here. Only by defeating the spirit of creation and making the great Tao complete, would one be qualified to step onto the end of the great Tao. Chapter 23:31. Zhang Yan was aware of the change in the creation qi and was thinking about how to use it. The world created by the creation spirit was their main goal, and it seemed like it could be used here, but he gave up on the idea after a quick thought. Not to mention the fact that the qi of creation could not affect each other, Even if it could, he would not use it here. There were other ways to destroy this world, and the chi of creation could be used elsewhere. However, he had yet to decide on what to do, so he kept the chi into his divine will with a thought. He said to the two patriarchs, "The spirit of creation used the chi of creation to construct the present world, and this is the only thing he can rely on to stabilize himself. If we can destroy it, we can make the spirit of creation unable to cling to it, and we can also make that wisp of chi of creation appear. I have already made arrangements in the present world, and we should try to find the location of that chi of creation." Patriarch Yao Han said, "Wait for me to find it." He was prepared to use the same method as before to find it, so with a flick of his sleeve, he used the same trick again. Boundless starlight spread out, and spiritual chi scattered everywhere, reflecting all the mighty force and chi activity. He said to Patriarch Hongho, "Fellow Taoist, please make your move." Patriarch Hongho responded and slashed down with sword light. The sword light collided with the Weili, and countless responses were transmitted. But this time, there was no emptiness like before. Both of them were a little surprised. There were not many places where this chi could go. If it wasn't in the silence void, then there were only two places it could enter. One was Bu Su Tian under Zhang Yan's rule, and the other was the real world created by the creation spirit. It was just one of the two. Zhang Yan also realized this, and his divine will inspected Bu Shutian. This place was completely under his control, and if the chi hid here, it would be impossible for it not to be discovered. He looked around and found nothing, so he said, "It's not here." The two patriarchs looked at the world created by the creation spirit. Since there was no chi in Bu Shutian, it could only be here. Forefather Yao Han said, "This world is created by the energy of fortune. Can the energy itself hide inside?" Zhang Yan, "That is possible." He had the creation chi in his hand. Although it was on the same level as the creation essence, and he couldn't fully understand its profoundness, he could still make a rough guess. No matter where the chi of creation hid, it did not have a direct intersection with the place where it was hiding. After its transformation, before its end, it only existed and did not exist. Therefore, the chi of creation was not in the same place as the place where it was hiding. It could only be said that the place where it was hiding was only a mark or entrance to find the chi of creation. Moreover, this chi would only appear when the modern world came to an end, so there was no conflict between the two. Founding Master Hong, he said, "Even if this chi could have landed here, how can we prove it? Guessing was just guessing. Without actually finding it, there was no way to be certain. Furthermore, only by knowing where the aura was would he be able to collect it." Zhang Yan thought for a moment and said, "Let's wait for a while, and we might be able to find it." Their mighty powers were unable to enter that world, but after the teachings of the Tao were spread there, they were able to observe the situation in the world. As long as they saw an empty space that was independent of this world, it would prove that the chi of creation was hiding there. Founding Master Yao Han said, "Fellow Taoist Shenyuan, from what you see, the chi of creation did not land in the void this time. Was it a coincidence, or was it caused by our actions?" Zhang Yan said, "This is not a coincidence. The creation chi did this to prevent itself from being exposed again. To be more precise, after the first strand of chi was taken away, to prevent itself from repeating the same mistake, it no longer hid in the void and went to another place. This was not the will of the creation chi. The chi of creation did not have such a thing, but it moved according to some kind of change. There were only a few places where it could hide. He believed that if he found this strand of chi of creation again, it would most likely appear in the Busu Tian next time." Founding Master Yao Han said, "I thought we could control our opponent with just the game on the chessboard. I didn't expect the creation spirit to use the creation chi to turn the tables." Founding Master Hongba also deeply agreed. Just now, their side had consecutively obtained several Tao techniques and obtained the land of creation essence. They clearly had a greater advantage, and their next step was to find a way to force the spirit of creation to retreat from the chessboard. However, they just had to be stuck here. Now, they had to first deal with the creation chi before they could do that. Zhang Yan smiled and said, "It's a good thing that we found this chi in advance. Even though it's a little troublesome, it can only delay the battle for a while. It can't change the outcome of the battle. When the spirit of creation used the chi of creation, it was in a passive state, so they could deal with it calmly. If they didn't do so and used it at a critical moment, the trouble it would cause them wouldn't be this small. At this moment, he suddenly felt something in his heart. He knew that his Taoist teachings had found a foundation in this world. He focused his eyes and looked at the world again. When he first looked at it, there was nothing different from before. However, as he focused his mind, he soon saw an empty space. This proved that the second wisp of creation chi was indeed immersed in this space. He said, "Fellow Taoists, I can see where the strand of creation chi is. If our Taoist teachings can win in this world and destroy this world, we can try to collect this chi." He knew that although the Taoist teachings of the three of them had spread in the world, they did not have any advantage in the beginning. The living beings here would not obtain the complete cultivation method right away. It was just that it would be easier for them to reach the higher levels if they worked hard in the direction they pointed out. This required countless generations of people to try again and again. Some of them had to reach a profound realm before more people would move towards this direction. If no one reached the upper realm along this path, then it might cause people to shrink back at the sight of it. Fortunately, his Taoist teachings were the method of teaching. At the same time that cultivators practiced their Taoist hearts, they would not consciously spread the Taoist teachings to the myriad of worlds in the universe, allowing more people to enjoy this method. There would always be one or two outstanding people amongst the billions of people. On the other hand, even though the Taoist teachings of the two founding ancestors, Hong Ho and Yao Han, were superior, only those who conformed to their Taoist teachings would be able to rise above the masses. Thus, there were comparatively fewer people who could obtain the Taoist teachings here. However, there was no fixed rule for the changes in the workings of the heavens. No matter how few people obtained the Taoist teachings, the person who walked to the end might appear here, so it was similarly worth paying attention to. As the living beings who cultivated the Taoist teachings of the three of them successively reached a profound realm, they were able to use it to roughly sense the situation in this world. They noticed that the spirit of creation was unlike them. It didn't have the slightest intention to spread the Taoist teachings to the myriad of worlds in the universe, and it seemed as if it wasn't within the scope of its consideration at all. The main point of its attention had always been on the reincarnated spirit, and it was constantly pushing it to advance towards a higher realm. However, even though the spirit had entered the world a long time ago, its path of cultivation wasn't extremely smooth, and it was precisely because it was affected by the tribulation energy. The tribulation energy that Zhang Yan poured into this world caused the cultivators here to encounter extremely many difficulties on their path of cultivation, and the most difficult barrier amongst them was the tribulation of the heart. The reincarnated spirit surpassed ordinary living beings by countless times, and it was able to rise rapidly by just comprehending a little of the Taoist teachings. However, once the tribulation of the heart appeared, it caused it to have to overcome its mental state, and this pulled it to the same level as numerous living beings. On the other hand, the more perfect its mental state was, the more likely it was that it would be able to comprehend itself. So, if the spirit of creation was unable to destroy the tribulation energy at its source, then it could only try to suppress the spirit's comprehension. However, if it did that, then it would cause the spirit's speed of cultivation to slow down. However, as the myriad of worlds rotated and the matters of the world progressed, countless cultivators encountered similar problems when they ascended to a higher realm. Fortunately, there were countless people in the myriad of worlds that had obtained their teachings. Even though many were obstructed by the tribulations of the heavens and the earth and heart barriers, causing their path to be bumpy, there were similarly many handsome and outstanding figures that had transcended because of this. Even though these people didn't advance as quickly as the spirit, they weren't far behind. Actually, if the spirit of creation was able to wipe out all living beings from the world, then all problems could be solved. However, it was actually impossible for it to accomplish this. Firstly, because of the tribulation energy, it was only able to maintain itself from falling, and the whaley would be driven back once it exceeded a certain limit. Moreover, its ability to resist all the great virtues of the human path was too great. Once the Whaley sank into the myriad of worlds, it would need to lower its own level. Otherwise, if it carelessly used the Whaley, it would cause the myriad of worlds to shatter. It had to be said that the modern world had its own set of rules, and the myriad of worlds were its foundation. If the Whaley broke it, the modern world might not necessarily collapse, but it would definitely head towards extinction. This was undoubtedly destroying its own foundation, so it could only ignore it. As both sides waited, the result of this round was soon revealed. Zhang Yan's eyes flashed. He could feel that even though he had done many obstructions and disturbances before, the other side's home ground advantage was still too great. Under the push of the spirit of creation, the spirit was the first to step into the true Yang realm. Ancestral Master Yao Han's expression sank. We still let the spirit of creation get one step ahead of us. In the future, our teachings will definitely be suppressed, and the hole in this world might be filled by someone else. Zhang Yan stared at the modern world and said, "It's hard to know what will happen until the end." After the spirit attained the true Yang realm, it started to suppress the universe, and it caused everything in the world to tilt in a direction that was beneficial to it. As time passed, more and more people who worshipped the spirit of creation's teachings would appear, and its advantage would grow greater and greater. But just as he had expected, the advantage of the teaching of creation's teachings was displayed here. There were still countless cultivators in the places where its magic power couldn't reach, and they were still climbing up with all their might. So the true outcome of this battle hadn't been decided yet. Chapter 23:32. Since the spirit of creation was the first to enter the Tao and cultivated extremely quickly, it had almost never encountered any decent opponents in the process of cultivating the Tao. On the contrary, mortals still had to face the invasion of other worldlings, various natural Whaley hazards, and even the continuation of the race. However, these people had overcome all of these, stubbornly and resolutely fumbling forward on the path of Tao. Seeing this scene, Ancestor Yao Han couldn't help but sigh. Although the people of Tao are in a difficult situation, they still don't forget to strive forward. Just as fellow Taoists said, this situation still needs to be observed. Zhang Yan looked at the world with his sleeves behind his back. Even though he had already reached a higher level and was not far from the great Tao, he had never underestimated the living beings of the mortal world. Especially since he himself had come from this world, he was well aware of the potential of this generation. Standing at the level of Vedanta, the mortals of the mortal world were insignificant and lowly, but once they encountered the orthodox Tao, they would have infinite possibilities. So what if that spirit was temporarily in power? As long as it was still in the true Yang realm, it would never be able to take care of the world outside of its own magic power. This gap was a trace of heaven's secret left by the rules of the Grand Tao. It wasn't deliberately left for the people of Tao, but was the order of the world. However, as long as the people of Tao didn't give up and continued to work hard in this direction, there would be a day when this natural chasm could be crossed. After that spirit achieved success, all the living beings under its rule would lean towards itself and forcefully change the wills of the people of the world, making it impossible for those below it to ascend to the true Yang realm. This was to ensure its own safety, not daring to let more people be on the same level as itself. However, as the world changed, the people of Tao would only become stronger until it broke through its shackles. Once the people of Tao became stronger, it would naturally weaken. In fact, the spirit of creation had taken the wrong path from the beginning. If it didn't focus on that spirit and treated all living beings equally, or simply supported the other worldlings against the people of Tao, it might be able to cut off the path of the people of Tao to advance. However, with its background, it was destined to not put effort in these aspects. When Zhang Yan thought up to here, he faintly comprehended something in his heart. The spirit of creation didn't devour the virtue of the Tao merely for the sake of obtaining a Tao technique, and perhaps it was also for the sake of making up for the aspect that it lacked. Although it was for the sake of completing the Tao, the spirit of creation did not have a human heart or a human nature, so it did not have any desire to climb higher. It was not consciously seeking the Tao, but for the sake of completing the Tao. Of course, the spirit of creation probably didn't realize this and was only acting on instinct. In fact, this made it even more difficult to deal with. This meant that the spirit of creation wouldn't retreat and wouldn't give up. It would either use the spirit of creation to devour all the great virtue as a trap, or they would defeat the spirit of creation. This battle could not be stopped from the very beginning. Patriarch Yao Han and Patriarch Hong Ho watched silently. Although they had also preached the Tao to the 9 continents back then, the main reason was not because they thought highly of the living beings of the world, nor was it purely for the sake of preaching the Tao. Instead, they had other plans. However, as they fought against the spirit of creation, their own cultivation gradually grew, and they gradually approached the great Tao. Only then did they realize that the living beings of the world were also worthy of attention. What needed to be said here was that it was not difficult for them to think of some things, but whether or not they were really compatible with the great Tao required repeated comprehension. If they could not comprehend it, they would not waste their time in this direction, because in their eyes, it was just a matter of comprehension. At this moment in the modern world, 1,000,000 years after the spirit of creation formed, someone from the human path finally reached true yang. According to common sense, this modern world was not attached to the land of creation, so origin jades should not have appeared here. However, with the evolution of the chi of creation, the impossible could become possible. Of course, everything was still under the rules of the great Tao, so the spirit of creation could obtain it, and so could the living beings of the human path. It was not that there was no price here. After this modern world disappeared, unless there was a powerful cultivator deliberately protecting it, then aside from those who had transcended the world, everything else would turn into nothingness. That spirit of creation was deeply influenced by the spirit of creation and viewed human path cultivators as its greatest threat. It naturally could not tolerate the appearance of such people, so after discovering this, it immediately came looking for them. A battle unavoidably broke out between the two. In the end, the spirit of creation relied on its more profound magic power to kill the cultivator. When Zhang Yan and the 2 ancestors saw this, they knew that a turning point had appeared. Although the spirit of creation had failed, it undoubtedly proved that the spirit of creation could not stop all human path cultivators from charging to a higher realm. Although the spirit of creation had failed, a true yang cultivator could not be destroyed for lower-level cultivators. After the spirit of creation dispersed the world, it did its best to teach the human path and answer its questions. It also reminded the people who came later that there were enemies in the upper realm, so if they succeeded, they needed to be especially careful. For the living beings of this world, no matter how much threat there was above them, once they set foot on the path of Tao, how could they stop? Moreover, on their path of cultivation in the past, they had encountered countless difficulties and tribulations. In their opinion, once they reached the upper realm, they would at least have a fighting chance. If they were willing to be weak and retreated like this, wouldn't they be even more powerless to resist when the great enemy wanted to take them down? As a result, not only did this warning not scare the cultivators below, it instead caused more people to head to the upper realm. In the millions of years that followed, cultivators of the human Tao broke through to this realm one after another. These people naturally couldn't avoid encountering the spirit. Some of them failed in their resistance, while some were lucky enough to escape and go into hiding. In the end, the spirit of creation could not take care of every corner of the world. As the number of human path cultivators gradually increased, they joined forces to fight against it. In the beginning, they were no match for it, but later on, they were gradually able to fight back and forth. At this moment, the human path in this world had already formed. If there was no external interference, the spirit of creation would be defeated by these human path cultivators sooner or later. At this moment, Patriarch Hong has said, the spirit of creation sees nothing other than itself. If not for that, how could the scene before us be like this? Zhang Yan nodded slightly. Patriarch Honghe's words could be said to have pointed out the flaw of the spirit of creation. It was not that the spirit of creation had no way to deal with the human path. For example, it could release its Tao and try to get more people to stand on its side. For example, it could support the otherworldly beings. These people were born to be enemies with the human path, so they were people that could be roped in. However, the spirit of creation was restricted by its own standpoint. In fact, it was worried that it would be the first to be threatened after releasing these restrictions. After rejecting these restrictions, there were very few methods it could use. Just as he thought, from the beginning to the end, that spirit had been fighting against tens of thousands of people all by himself. How could he possibly achieve victory like this? Founding ancestor Yao Han said, "The appearance of this place is the crux of the creation spirit's connection to itself. If it sees any signs of failure, it won't let that spirit fall into oblivion. It will definitely correct its mistakes and try to salvage the situation." Zhang Yan agreed with this. He discussed it with the two patriarchs and believed that even if the spirit of creation had other methods to bind itself, it wouldn't give up on this world so easily. However, they had already done what they could. Now, it all depended on whether these human path cultivators could persevere. As expected, after seeing that it couldn't fight against the human path cultivators on its own, the spirit of creation changed its strategy under the influence of the spirit of creation. It began to consciously support the otherworldly beings. At this moment, Zhang Yan raised his eyebrows. He realized that the spirit of creation was guiding the otherworldly beings not to walk the path of qi, but to walk the path of strength. Now, the entire path of strength was under his control. As long as one or two otherworldly beings achieved Tao, they would be able to divide his power. However, the spirit of creation's original intention was probably not this. The power it transmitted was completely derived from itself, and there was no possibility of it transcending the present world. At its peak, it would be at the level of true yang. However, this Tao of strength needed to devour human path cultivators as nourishment. Its goal should be to find a way to make these otherworldly beings work for the spirit of creation, forever standing on the opposite side of human path. He smiled. If the spirit of creation had done this earlier, it might have been possible to suppress human path. However, it was a little too late now. Human path was already established, and it wouldn't let these otherworldly beings ascend so easily. He looked for a while longer before saying, "Fellow Taoists, we should prepare for the aftermath of the collapse of this world." Patriarch Hongba said, "Once this world collapses, the spirit of creation will have nowhere to hide. The spirit of creation will naturally lose its connection, and it will have other methods to maintain itself." Patriarch Yao Han said, "Fortunately, fellow Taoist Xianyuan seized the tribulation power. Otherwise, the spirit of creation would probably be facing the difficulties that the spirit of creation is facing right now. In a game of chess, a single misstep would require many more steps to recover. The spirit of creation lost the opportunity in the battle of tribulation power and Tao techniques. Not only did he lose a Tao technique, he also had to face the constant pressure of the tribulation power. Now, he had to maintain his own existence before he could talk about targeting human path's great virtue. If not for the qi of creation helping him to salvage the situation, he would probably have been forced out of the great Tao chessboard. Zhang Yan said, "If the spirit of creation uses Taoist arts to place down pieces to expel the tribulation energy or maintain itself, then it couldn't be any better. In this way, it might not have the intention to fight us on the chessboard of the Grand Tao." Ever since he obtained those Tao techniques, he had always wanted to force the spirit of creation off the great Tao chessboard. In his opinion, the reason why the spirit of creation didn't retreat was because he still wanted to use the advantage of the great Tao chessboard to devour Patriarch Yao Han and Patriarch Hongba. The spirit of creation probably thought that the remaining pieces he had were barely enough for him to do what he wanted. However, if he had one less piece, it would be difficult to achieve his goal, so he didn't want to place another piece on the chessboard. If he could make good use of the opportunity before him and force the spirit of creation to place a piece to maintain himself, then the spirit of creation might very well give up on the chessboard and fight them in a real sense. Chapter 23:33. After the spirit of creation imparted the power path technique, it had indeed helped that spirit to alleviate the crisis to a certain extent. After one of the beasts attained Tao, he had even helped that spirit to force back the human path cultivators several times. It seemed like there was still a chance for him to make a comeback. The spirit of creation's actions were actually following the heavens in a certain sense. Due to the teachings of Yen, after billions of years of Tao technique inheritance, almost everyone in the myriad of worlds that had living beings would know how to cultivate Tao. The disciples of Yen usually didn't need external objects to cultivate, but after the Tao technique spread, it wasn't just the teachings that existed. Countless other Tao techniques were created by the people of the world. Living in the world, people ultimately had to ask for things from the world, causing the demand for external objects to greatly increase. The beasts devoured human path cultivators to cultivate, and it just happened to curb this trend. That was why the first beast obtained the origin jade to attain Tao. But after that, there was no more progress. After all, the goal of cultivation itself was to transcend the shackles of heaven and earth. Even the beasts themselves were included in this. Not only was it more difficult for beasts to cultivate than living beings, but after the human path learned of the threat of this generation, they also took the initiative to encircle and suppress them, greatly reducing the number of beasts. As a result, after billions of years, not a single beast was able to obtain the origin jade, and they all fell into the hands of the human path. Zhang Yan and the two patriarchs had noticed this a long time ago. Judging from the current situation, that spirit could no longer make a comeback. It was only a matter of time before he was killed by the human path cultivators. However, they did not relax because of this. When this world disintegrated, the chi of creation that was slumbering within it would definitely appear. They also had to think of a way to seize this wisp of creation chi so that the spirit of creation wouldn't be able to use it again. Now, it all depended on how the spirit of creation would maintain itself. This was something that humans couldn't avoid no matter what. Just as they were thinking, the three of them sensed something and couldn't help but look at the chessboard. At this moment, that mysterious feeling appeared again. Patriarch Yao Han said solemnly, "This is the third wisp of creation chi." Patriarch Hong He said, "No matter how much creation chi he possesses, we'll deal with him one by one. We'll definitely be able to make him exhaust all his means." At that moment, two more figures appeared beside the spirit of creation on the chessboard. Zhang Yan raised his head and looked over. He realized that these two people were Jizhuang Daoren and Taoist Wei Ming. His eyes narrowed slightly. These two people were undoubtedly the spirits of creation. After the spirit of creation swallowed the great virtue, it would be able to obtain the great virtue, and it could even make the person appear again. The two of them could be said to be a part of the spirit of creation, but when they were released, they were separated from it. Even their thoughts were completely their own. Ancestral Master Yao Han said, "The creation spirit summoned these two fellow Taoists to use their Weili to sustain itself. Can fellow Taoists use tribulation power to chase them away?" Zhang Yan shook his head slightly. "The creation chi is used here. It can no longer be suppressed by tribulation power." He could sense that the two people's Weili and the three's Weili had collided and intertwined. Even if he tried to wipe them away with his thoughts, he wouldn't be able to get rid of them. This was the effect of the creation chi. The Weili of the spirit of creation had also attached itself to them. From now on, even if the spirit of creation was killed by a human path cultivator, it would no longer be suppressed by tribulation power. Through this indirect method, it had once again cleverly resolved the danger of being chased away. This method wasn't without its flaws. For example, Zhang Yan only needed to place a piece on the chessboard of the Great Tao to completely erase it. However, if he placed a piece, the spirit of creation would definitely place a piece as well. In this way, it would return to the same old path, and the advantage it had previously accumulated would be handed over to someone else. After Xiangjue and Wei Ming appeared, they bowed to Zhang Yan and the two ancestral masters and said, "I didn't think we would meet fellow Taoists again. We had no choice, so please forgive us if we offended you." Although they had their own consciousness, if the spirit of creation really wanted them to do something, even if it wanted them to fight against Zhang Yan's trio, they wouldn't be able to resist. It could be said that this was the Tao of the spirit of creation. Once the great virtue was completely devoured, it would be able to control everything. Zhang Yan understood that if he wanted to sever the spirit of creation's Weili connection, he would have to deal with these two first. But even if these two were just borrowing bodies, they wouldn't be as strong as them. But great virtue was still a great virtue. This was different from the previous game in the lower levels. If they didn't place a piece to expel them, they would have to use the Whaley to eliminate them. This would be a head-on battle, but in reality, they couldn't do this right now. Previously, no matter how they played against the spirit of creation, it was only a small-scale Whaley confrontation. Even the tribulation power was an advantage brought by the Tao of collection. If they directly attacked the spirit of creation or the body it was borrowing, it would be the same as taking the initiative to move the chessboard. Although they had this plan from the start, the person who retreated first would have to pay a greater price, so they tried to force the spirit of creation to retreat first. Of course, if both sides were willing to retreat, then it would be like the two sides establishing the chessboard of the Great Tao, and no one would have to pay the price. But the problem was that the spirit of creation clearly hadn't given up on seizing benefits from the chessboard of the Great Tao, so it naturally didn't want to retreat. Ancestral Master Yao Han said, "If this fellow had used this method before, we might not have been able to do anything to him. Why did he wait until now to use it?" Zhang Yan thought about it and felt that the most likely reason was that this person had originally used this method to help him devour Ancestral Master Yao Han and Ancestral Master Hongho, so he had been hiding it all this time. Now that he was forced to this point, he had no choice but to use it. He looked up at the two ancestral masters and said, before the spirit of creation uses up all his methods, he clearly isn't willing to give up on the chessboard. If we can't use methods outside of the chessboard to expel Taoist Xiangjue and Taoist Weiming, then we will have to return to the chessboard to resolve this matter. Ancestral Master Yao Han thought for a moment and said, "This is indeed a difficult matter, but..." His tone became slightly heavier. "What if the two of them are willing to cut off their connection with the spirit of creation?" Zhang Yan's gaze flickered. "Did you learn something?" Both Taoist Xiangjue and Taoist Weiming were currently under the control of the spirit of creation, but since Ancestral Master Yao Han said so, he wouldn't speak without thinking. Ancestral Master Yao Han chuckled and looked at Ancestral Master Hongho. "Taoist Hongho, do you have a way to sever the connection between the spirit of creation and those two?" Ancestral Master Hongho solemnly replied, "I can sever it for an instant, but only for an instant." Ancestral Master Yao Han pondered for a moment and slowly said, "That is enough." He said to Zhang Yan, "As long as Taoist Hongho severed it for an instant, I will use my Whaley to transfer it to Taoist Xiangjue and Taoist Weiming. As long as the two of them don't resist, I will be able to expel the two of them." Zhang Yan thought about it. According to this method, success or failure would depend on Taoist Xiangjue and Taoist Weiming. Ancestor Yao Han and Ancestor Hong Bo had only given them a chance to choose. If the two of them were willing to be chased away, then their plan would be a success. However, if they were unwilling or hesitant, then all of this would be for naught. Now that Taoist Xiangjue and Taoist Hongho had become a part of the spirit of creation, there was no such thing as eternal silence. If they could be expelled, then even if the spirit of creation could evolve them again, the chi of creation would no longer be able to affect them. He said, "Previously, we used all sorts of methods to fight against the spirit of creation. Just now, we have forced it into a disadvantageous position. We can't allow it to easily reverse the situation. Even if there is only the slightest chance, as long as it is beneficial to the battle, it is worth a try." After a brief discussion, the three of them came to a decision. There was no need to wait for the outcome of the battle in the present world. They could just directly attack. Ancestral Master Hongho gathered his chi for a moment, then pressed his fingers together like a sword and slashed forward. In an instant, a wisp of sword chi appeared out of nowhere and slashed between the spirit of creation and Taoist Weiming and Taoist Weiming. At this moment, the connection between the two sides was severed for an instant. Ancestral Master Yao Han also acted at the same time. With a wave of his sleeve, streaks of dazzling stardust rushed towards the two people and instantly landed on them. A deep glint flashed in Zhang Yan's eyes. He had also increased the pressure on the creation spirit. However, even though they had made arrangements to deal with it, they did not have much confidence. After all, the human heart had always been the most complicated thing. The reason why the spirit of creation had called out Taoist Hongho and Taoist Hongho instead of others was probably because they had the most thoughts. What position did the two of them stand on? What did they know about themselves? Had the spirit of creation instilled something into them? They didn't know these, so they couldn't make a clear judgment. They could only wait for the results. Taoist Hongho and Taoist Hongho were in a trance. They suddenly felt the shackles on their bodies disappear, and the restraints imposed on them by the spirit of creation disappeared as well. Then, a Weili came to push them. They immediately understood the intentions of Zhang Yan and the others. At this moment, as long as they didn't resist and followed this force, it would only take an instant for them to disappear from everything and return to where they came from. However, they also knew that if they retreated now, they would never have the chance to come out again. After being released, they inexplicably learned some things that they didn't know before. For example, if the spirit of creation seized the great Tao, they might be able to return it when it reached the upper realm. From this standpoint, it seemed that it was more appropriate for them to help the spirit of creation. However, they also suspected that this might have been deliberately left in their memories by the spirit of creation. In fact, there was no such thing, so it could be considered a difficult choice. Compared to this, they actually hoped that Zhang Yan and the two ancestral masters could use the chessboard of the Great Tao to help them free themselves instead of being so easily eliminated. Chapter 23-34. Right now, Wei Ming and Xiangjue needed to make a decision in an instant. Originally, both of them possessed the divine wills and could ponder for a long time in this unknown place. They could weigh the pros and cons and make a safer choice, but neither of them chose to use it. Ancestral Master Hongba had indeed severed the Weili connection between the spirit of creation and their qi activity, allowing them to regain their freedom for a moment. However, they were still borrowing the spirit of creation. Once the divine wills were activated, the spirit of creation might follow, and they would be controlled by the latter once again. The two could feel the pushing force, but they were extremely unwilling to leave just like that. At this moment, the two exchanged glances and came to a decision at the same time. Their originally flickering figures suddenly became solid. The starlight rushed toward them, but was blocked by layers of Weili. Ancestral Master Hongba saw this and said regretfully, "It seems that the two of them are unwilling to leave. Fellow Taoist Xianyuan, do you want to make other plans?" Zhang Yan's eyes flickered. "Let's try again later." Ancestral Master Yao Han pondered for a moment. The spirit of creation is already on guard. If we try again, I'm afraid there won't be another chance. Zhang Yan said, "It's precisely because the two of them rejected it once before that the spirit of creation is at ease. Besides, fellow Taoist Hongba's sword isn't that easy to break. However, once the spirit of creation catches its breath, it'll be hard to say." Ancestral Master Yao Han nodded. "If fellow Taoist thinks it's feasible, then try again. Just now, the two of them have already rejected it. Where do you think the turning point lies?" Just now, Wei Ming and Xiangjue were unwilling to be driven away by the Weili. They had clearly made a clear choice. They had also cultivated step by step and were not reincarnated from the fragments of the spirit of creation. Their minds were firm, and since they had made their choice, they would not hesitate and would only walk the path to the end. Zhang Yan looked across the chessboard and said, "That's not the case." Although the two of them resisted fellow Taoist Weili, their true thoughts weren't there. Just now, in addition to using tribulation power to suppress the spirit of creation, he was also thinking about the two of them's true thoughts at that moment. The human heart was complicated, and no one could understand it completely. However, whenever the overall situation changed, it would always reflect the truest side of one's heart. Even if the two of them were just borrowing the spirit of creation, it wasn't that they didn't want to be free. From his point of view, perhaps he wanted to be rescued by them at this moment, rather than be exiled and become a sacrificial pawn. Being driven away meant dying, and it was impossible for them to appear again. But if they didn't move, then at the very least, the spirit of creation needed them right now. Before victory and defeat were decided, the two of them would be able to survive. After that, they would the spirit and the two of the spirit of the essence. However, if they directly told the two of them that they did not need to worry about their survival, and that they would help them return after they won the battle and gained control of the Great Tao, that would be empty words. Why would the other side believe them? On the other hand, they would think that they were just making a promise to get through the difficult situation. That was why they needed to see something useful and let them judge for themselves. That was better than them telling them directly. He noticed that after the two of them appeared, the spirit of creation had blocked their senses. The two of them couldn't sense anything in the outside world at all. So, from their point of view, the spirit of creation was undoubtedly at a disadvantage. This seriously affected their judgment. Even if they were inclined to the spirit of creation, they would probably be swayed. After all, no one wanted to stay on the ship that could sink. However, the actual situation was exactly the opposite. Therefore, what he needed to do now was actually very simple. As long as he severed the connection, he would conveniently lay out the real situation before them for them to see. After that, he would see what choice they would make. After explaining to the two patriarchs, he said, "Please use your magic power again." Patriarch Hongho didn't say anything else. He raised his finger and slashed out with sword chi again. Patriarch Yao Han did the same as just now. Rays of star-like brilliance rushed towards the two of them. The two of them noticed that the spirit of creation didn't move at this time. They didn't know if it knew that it couldn't fight back under the suppression of the robbery power, or if it thought that they were just repeating what they did last time and there was no need to stop it. Zhang Yan, on the other hand, continued to use the calamity power on the opposite side of the chessboard. He felt that it was a pity. Now, the spirit of creation was connected to two places. One was to Glimmer and Xiangjue, and the other was to the present world created by them. If they could wait a little longer and wait for both sides to attack at the same time, they could cut off all the connections at once. That way, they might be able to force the spirit of creation to make a move on the chessboard. However, they couldn't wait any longer. It wasn't that there was no way to break Patriarch Hongho's sword. If the spirit of creation found it, it would be very difficult to find another opportunity. So, they could only break one side first. On the other side, Wei Ming and Perception felt the same pushing force as last time. The two of them were a little puzzled. They didn't know why Dada was still trying so hard. Did they think that they were weak-willed people? Since they had made their choice, they wouldn't change their stance so easily. At this moment, they suddenly felt a sword light fly up from the opposite side. When they looked over, they saw countless scenes flash before them. It was Zhang Yan imitating Patriarch Hongho's sword. He used sword light to break through the obstruction and presented the current situation of the battle to the two of them. Both of their hearts skipped a beat. Although the sword light only appeared for a moment, it was enough for them to understand the situation in front of them. At this moment, their thoughts rapidly changed. It must be known that the two of them were utilitarian people. They were already being borrowed by the spirit of creation. If the spirit of creation won in the end, they could only believe in what the spirit of creation had instilled in them. However, according to the current situation, the human path clearly had the advantage, while the spirit of creation was in a predicament and in a completely passive situation. Although they didn't think that the spirit of creation would fail just like that, if Dada's side had a chance of winning, then they would have to choose carefully. After all, they were originally people of human path. It must be known that apart from them, there were several other fellow Taoists who had also been devoured by the spirit of creation. Therefore, if they could win this battle, then everyone would be returned, and they would be free. After some consideration, they immediately made a choice that suited their own interests. Although they were still reluctant, the two of them let go of all resistance and let the Wei push them towards endless peace. The two of them were borrowing bodies and didn't truly enter silence, but the Wei seemed to have entered silence and separated from everything else. However, just as it was about to disappear, the pushing force suddenly weakened a little. The two of them were shocked. It seemed that this was the power of the spirit of creation. It must be known that Patriarch Hongba had only fought for a moment. If there was even the slightest delay, the spirit of creation would be able to drag them back. Zhang Yan's eyes narrowed slightly. It was clear that the spirit of creation had gained some experience after witnessing the methods of the two patriarchs. Although it couldn't use much strength under the siege of the tribulation power, it could make the two Wei's influence even shorter. However, the spirit of creation had methods, and so did the two of them. Otherwise, he wouldn't be at ease letting the two patriarchs try again. At some point, a figure that looked exactly like him appeared behind Patriarch Yao Han. As the two of them exerted their strength at the same time, the Whaley's impact increased by more than a level. Under the push of this sudden increase in strength, the figures of Glimmer and Perception quickly turned from corporeal to incorporeal and disappeared without a trace. Zhang Yan pondered for a moment, then turned his gaze towards Zhuyu. Once the two of them left, the creation aura that was originally in charge of attaching to the spirit of creation also ended its transformation and emerged from its dormant state. If this aura was retrieved by the spirit of creation, then it could be released again to lend a body. Fortunately, he was prepared for this. The chi of creation appeared in the void for the first time, and then hid in the present world created by the spirit of creation. However, because this chi followed the law of change, it wouldn't stay in one place repeatedly. So this time, it landed in Bu Su Tian. Bu Su Tian was now completely under his control. Even if he didn't take the chi now, others wouldn't be able to take it away. So, with just a thought, he calmly took the chi. Although this chi was not small, it was even more helpful to the spirit of creation. It could cause it to repeatedly entangle itself outside the chessboard, so he would rather not use it than give the spirit of creation a chance to take it back. Patriarch Yao Han shook his head with a smile and said, "As expected, people's hearts change." The spirit of creation released these two in hopes that they would judge the situation, but it isn't a good thing to have too many thoughts. Zhang Yan said, "This is one of them. In fact, these two also have the heart to seek Tao. This is the greatest obsession of us cultivators. If we follow the spirit of creation, we will never have the chance to obtain Tao. If the human path is in power, they still have a glimmer of hope to obtain Tao, so they stood here." Patriarch Hongba said, "These two are no longer Weili, so the spirit of creation can only rely on the present world." Zhang Yan nodded slightly. If the spirit of creation no longer had the chi of creation, then the wisp of chi activity that was immersed in the present world would be very crucial. If they could still obtain it, then the battle at the corner would come to an end. If they were careless and failed, the spirit of creation would definitely be able to use this opportunity to delay for a while. In the present world, hundreds of millions of years had passed, and the human path cultivator's advantage had become greater and greater. Later on, when the spirit of creation realized that a head-on battle would not work, it used a roundabout strategy. It used all kinds of opportunities to discuss Tao with the human path cultivators, secretly seeking reconciliation and encouraging the latter to go to a higher level. Once this person transcended the present world, because of the spirit of creation's Weili obstruction, it could not return to the present world, so it could not pose a threat to him. This indeed had the effect of delaying, but in the end, it could not reverse the situation. Under the full force of the human path cultivator's encirclement, the spirit of creation could not escape, and its Dharma body was completely destroyed, no longer existing. Chapter 23:35. As soon as the spirit died, the connection between the spirit of creation and everything was completely severed. The power of the tribulation power that enveloped him suddenly increased, and it kept pushing him towards the silence. Zhang Yan and the two ancestral masters looked across the chessboard, waiting to see what choice the spirit of creation would make. This step was extremely crucial, and it wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that it would affect all subsequent games. This time, the spirit of creation didn't intend to continue pestering him. He stretched out his hand and tapped the Grand Tao chessboard, placing a chess piece down. In an instant, the tribulation power that enveloped his body retreated. He used the laws of the Great Tao to avoid the tribulation power, so even if he played the chessboard, the tribulation power would be useless against him. Zhang Yan's spirits rose. The spirit of creation had previously avoided placing a chess piece in every possible way, but now that he had placed it, it meant that he had given up on his original strategy after being repeatedly pressured. However, without the tribulation power restraining him, the modern world was completely in the spirit of creation's hands. He could decide when this place would collapse. This situation was the same as when he controlled Bu Su Tian. It was completely the spirit of creation's home field, so they probably wouldn't be able to obtain a wisp of creation chi trapped within. At this moment, the creation spirit unleashed its mighty energy, instantly filling up the entire world. Then, it destroyed the myriad worlds within, destroying all living beings along the way. The entire modern world was shaken from the inside, and it began to slowly collapse. A moment later, the spirit of creation withdrew the wisp of creation chi and allowed the modern world to continue collapsing. Clearly, in its eyes, this place no longer held any value. Seeing this, Zhang Yan pondered for a moment, then waved his sleeve at the modern world. He wouldn't be able to obtain the wisp of creation chi, but he could still do some things. Although the modern world had collapsed, he had restored all the living beings of the human path that the spirit of creation had destroyed and placed them in Bu Su Tian. Virtuous beings were high above. Billions of years passed in the modern world in an instant, and these living beings seemed to be meaningless to them. However, if the world was allowed to continue and this person died on his own, then there was indeed no need for him to interfere. However, the spirit of creation directly collapsed and appeared in the world. This was interfering with luck, ending everything ahead of time. Even though these creatures didn't do it intentionally, they were still doing it just now to help them win this round. This generation's life shouldn't end here. Even though it was only a few true Yang Taoists who killed the spirit in the end, if it weren't for the numerous living beings that served as the soil for the countless outstanding talents that emerged over the course of billions of years to fight against the spirit, they wouldn't have succeeded. After the spirit of creation collected the wisp of chi of creation, it didn't stay in its hand for long. It pressed down with a flip of its hand, and the chi of creation was summoned once again. It could be seen that the chi of creation rotated within the all that exists and reappeared. His movements didn't stop here. He stretched out his hand and tapped, and he actually placed another chess piece on the chessboard of the Great Tao. The expressions of Zhang Yan and the two ancestral masters froze. The successive actions of the spirit of creation seemed to be slightly unusual. However, after waiting for a moment, nothing happened. Ancestral Master Yao Han and Ancestral Master Hong Ho each made a deduction, but they realized that the whereabouts of the chess piece were unknown. They didn't know what effect it had. After all, after the rules of the Great Tao were activated, it wasn't easy to see before it appeared. Zhang Yan raised his brows. The current world couldn't have been created by the spirit of creation randomly. It definitely had a great effect. But what could it be used in the current world now? His thoughts raced. Looking at the placement of chess pieces by the spirit of creation, it had always considered the matters of the upper echelons first. Therefore, the current world was only used as a vessel, and the more crucial things weren't here. Thinking of this, his heart stirred, and he vaguely had some ideas. At this moment, Ancestral Master Hong Ho said, "No matter what arrangements he has, as long as the current world exists, it can't be unrelated to all living beings. I'll treat it as transmitting the Tao technique into it. If there's any abnormal movement, we can also have a response." Zhang Yan nodded and said, "Fellow Taoist is right, it should be so." Regardless of whether things were as he guessed, there was no mistake in doing this, and it could also be used as a test. The three of them made up their minds, and together, they rose into the Weili and surged towards the current world. As expected, they bumped into the spirit of creation Weili, and successfully transmitted the Tao technique into the current world. The spirit of creation didn't seem to have any reaction, and let the current world evolve on its own. Zhang Yan observed for a while longer, and he smiled slightly. He and this person went back and forth on the chessboard a few times. Sometimes, the opponent's goal didn't need to be deduced, and he could feel it through the game. This time, it was targeted at his strength path Tao technique. In the current world that collapsed previously, the spirit of creation had already used this move, but it wasn't successful. Putting aside whether this person could transcend, even if he came out, he wouldn't be able to advance to the next level, and he wouldn't be able to grasp the strength path Tao technique. Therefore, he was sure that this person had his eyes on those creation Pauline, and wanted to use it to push more people out to disperse his power. However, after he achieved strength path, those creation Pauline all shattered, and there seemed to be another kind of change at that time. The purpose of this person's chess piece was to borrow the power of the great Tao chessboard to reconstruct these creation Pauline. As for why this person didn't use the current world just now, and instead wanted to build another one, it was because the original domain was almost occupied by the human path, and it was impossible for the strength path to rise again. Therefore, it was necessary to tear it down and start anew. His mind changed. The spirit of creation wanted to weaken his power on the chessboard, and no longer wanted to swallow one of the patriarchs. This meant that this person was already considering the future of the great Tao chessboard, or else he wouldn't have shifted his focus here. He immediately transmitted his discovery to the two patriarchs, and when the two saw it, they realized that it was indeed the case. Patriarch Yao Han smiled and said, "It seems like the spirit of creation has sensed that the strength path technique you practice is a great threat to him, or else he wouldn't have done this." Zhang Yan thought for a while and said, "Fellow Taoists, I want to use the creation qi. Do you have any thoughts on this?" It was extremely difficult to achieve strength path, and if a human path cultivator didn't first achieve qi path like him, then cultivate strength path, then it would be almost impossible for him to achieve strength path. Those who could use this method to transcend were mostly different. If this person transcended, he could try to destroy him to maintain the integrity of the strength path. However, if he could do it, the spirit of creation could also stop him. And this time, because the spirit of creation didn't have the suppression of the tribulation power, he had the final say in the current world, and they couldn't interfere too much. Therefore, he decided to just cut off this path, and this way he wouldn't have to be entangled with this person. Patriarch Hong he said, "Since fellow Taoist is in charge of the situation, if fellow Taoist thinks it's fine to do this, then go ahead and do it. We have no objections." Patriarch Yao Han also said, "That's how it should be." Seeing that the two agreed, Zhang Yan waved his sleeve and threw the wisp of creation qi in his hand down, and it instantly disappeared. From now on, until this current world was destroyed, no one who cultivated strength path would be able to transcend. Then, his expression turned serious, and a sharp glint appeared in his eyes. Just now, he wanted to force the spirit of creation out of the chessboard, and now it seemed that the time was ripe. Patriarch Hong He and Patriarch Yao Han could clearly feel the vigor coming from him. Patriarch Yao Han said solemnly, "Fellow Taoist Xinyuan, are you ready to make your move?" Zhang Yan slowly nodded and said, "This move has accumulated a lot of momentum, and it depends on how the spirit of creation responds. If he doesn't retreat, then he can't beat us on the chessboard, and maybe we can get rid of him once and for all." Both Patriarch Hong He and Patriarch Yao Han nodded solemnly. They knew of Zhang Yan's plan, and they also knew how powerful this move was. It could be said that all the momentum he had accumulated was for this move. In fact, part of the reason why the great benefactors were willing to let Zhang Yan come up to preside over the situation was because of this. If everything went smoothly, there was a high chance that the spirit of creation would be defeated. Zhang Yan raised his sleeve, and with 2 fingers, he also placed a piece on the chessboard. At this moment, the entire great Tao chessboard shook. It seemed like something had happened, but it also seemed like nothing had happened. However, it was not difficult for the spirit of creation on the other side to distinguish that Zhang Yan's move had clearly triggered the chess momentum that he had accumulated previously, causing the great Tao's luck to be far greater than before. That was why it had caused such a huge commotion. However, he also couldn't calculate where exactly this piece should be placed. He could only feel a heavy threat enveloping his body, as if he continued to stay on the great Tao chessboard, he would be devoured by the other side. The spirit of creation didn't have human emotions, so he naturally didn't hesitate. After sensing danger, he immediately chose to avoid it. He stood up, and with a flick of his sleeve, he directly retreated from the great Tao chessboard. The great Tao chessboard was originally created by the combined qi of both sides. Now that he had forcefully escaped without the great benefactor's permission, he was bound to pay a heavy price. Not only did he lose a portion of his qi weili, he had no choice but to throw away all the pieces he hadn't used. In other words, he could no longer use these Tao techniques. Not only that, except for his most fundamental Tao techniques, he had almost spat out all the Tao techniques he had taken from the great benefactors. It could be said that from this moment on, he couldn't even use the body he had borrowed. It wasn't that he didn't want to use up all the remaining pieces before leaving, but he had calculated that even if he took out all the pieces, he wouldn't be able to resist the great benefactor's methods. Moreover, if he continued to delay, he wouldn't even have the chance to leave. Zhang Yan looked at this scene, but he was still very calm. Even though the spirit of creation had suffered such a great loss, the Tao techniques hadn't been truly transformed into his own due to the great underworld patriarch's suppression, so he hadn't lost much of his true strength. However, his side had finally achieved their goal, and they could now go all out and fight. He spread his sleeves, stood up, and raised his voice. Fellow Taoists, we should also leave the great Tao chessboard and go down to fight. Please remember this book's domain name, 9 Heavens Godly Emperor Mobile Version. Chapter 23:36. As soon as Zhang Yan finished speaking, he took the lead and walked down from the great Tao chessboard. Grandmaster Hong Ho and Grandmaster Yao Han nodded silently and got up as well. They walked towards Zhu Yu. As soon as the two of them left, the great Tao chessboard lost its strength. It immediately collapsed and began to collapse. At this moment, Zhang Yan felt the vital energy in his body shake without end, and the Tao art he grasped was in chaos. This was because the great Tao law was being pushed by them just now. Even though it was just a small shift, the great Tao didn't operate according to the original order. Now that it had returned to its original state, there were many places that were not harmonious. They were under the great Tao, so they could feel this deeply. Fortunately, the creation spirit had left the chessboard first, so most of the pressure was borne by him. Grandmaster Hong Ho calculated in his heart and said, "Now that the heavenly secrets are in chaos and the principles are disorderly, it's not the time to fight." Zhang Yan nodded. Now that the great Tao was returning to its original position, if they attacked now, they would be fighting against the power of the great Tao. Now that the creation spirit didn't move, it was obvious that it was waiting for the heavenly secrets to calm down. Grandmaster Yao Han said, "It's a pity." Just now, the creation spirit saw that the situation wasn't right and decisively left the great Tao chessboard. If it didn't do that, I'm afraid we could have won in one fell swoop. Zhang Yan smiled and said, "Even if we left the chessboard, this chess piece can still be used. In the end, we have to let the creation spirit have a taste of it." This move was powerful because it didn't just rely on the rules of the great Tao. Even if he left the great Tao chessboard, he could still use it. Now that the seed was planted, it just depended on when he could summon it. First, it depended on the timing. Second, it was up to him. At this moment, he suddenly sensed something and looked at Zhu Yu. His gaze seemed to be able to observe many things. He said, "Fellow Taoists, your Tao techniques have returned to the great Tao." The great Tao was emotionless. It was both vast and small. Looking from a higher point, everything was one, so there was no distinction between Tao and Tao. It was only because after to obtain Tao, he would leave a mark in the great Tao. This was ruled by his emotions, so different Tao and Tao were born. When a deity refinement cultivator entered into silence, it meant that he was far away from everything. When a great virtue cultivator entered into silence, it usually meant that his Tao body was expelled and his Tao returned to the great Tao. The so-called return meant that he had lost his great virtue and the imprint would naturally disappear. Ancestor Yao Han sighed. "Even if everyone's Tao returns to the great Tao, if we can win this battle, we might still have a chance to return it to its original state." Founding Master Hongba said, "It's better than being devoured by the spirit of creation." Zhang Yan nodded and said, "That's right. I believe that if everyone had a choice, you wouldn't want to do this either." If the great virtue was devoured by the spirit of creation, once the latter turned these Tao technique imprints into his own, he would be able to return from the silence. Because he had lost his original Tao, he could no longer be called a great virtue. Although the spirit of creation took the initiative to remove the chessboard and threw away all the Tao techniques, the final result still depended on the outcome of the battle. If he won and gained control of the great Tao, then these changes would be meaningless. He thought for a moment and asked, "After the essence of creation shattered, when the spirit of creation appeared just now, did you two Taoists see what he did?" Although he saw the scene of the essence of creation shattering, the great virtue was at most a blurry silhouette, and it was constant and unchanging. It was only an imprint that showed his existence. As for who did what, unless someone took the initiative to tell him, it was difficult for him to see it. Founding Master Hongbo said, "When the spirit of creation appeared, I slashed at him with my sword." Ancestor Yao Han smiled and said, "That's right. The creation spirit came to devour great virtue, and everyone else avoided it. Only Taoist Hong Piao didn't show any fear when he appeared, and he took the initiative to fight with him." Founding Master Hongbo said, "If fellow Taoist wishes to watch, I naturally have nothing to hide." As he spoke, he transferred his divine will over. Zhang Yan received the strand of divine will and looked at it with rapt attention. The scene at that time was reflected in front of him. He saw a sword light that was almost filled with divine will and slashed into the void. His gaze was fixed on it. Not only did Founding Master Hongbo's divine will show him the scene at that time, it also showed him the profoundness of the sword. Even though he was already above this person in terms of the might of the Tao, in terms of the Tao of the sword, Ancestor Hongho, who possessed this Tao, was naturally more profound. This sword strike had indeed struck the spirit of creation, and to a certain extent, it had even restrained the spirit of creation. If it was purely in terms of Weili, Founding Master Hongbo was naturally inferior to the spirit of creation. However, his sword technique had reached the pinnacle of sharpness among Taoist techniques. As long as the spirit of creation could not take him down in advance or understand the profoundness of the sword, he could only receive the slash and not be able to block it. He looked into the void. This should be where the spirit of creation was. However, Founding Master Hongbo's divine will could not carry him, which was why he looked like this. There was no doubt in his heart that he tacitly approved of his existence. However, at that moment, a ball of spiritual light shone, and the figure of the spirit of creation was reflected there. This was because his divine will could reflect him. After the spirit of creation was struck by the sword, he raised his head and looked in his direction. Zhang Yan's eyes were extremely calm. He wanted to fight the spirit of creation head-on, so he naturally would not avoid a confrontation above the divine will. When the qi of both sides collided, the entire divine will scene collapsed. Zhang Yan felt his aura waver, but when he looked up again, he found that he had not returned to the all-you, but had arrived in an unfathomable and mysterious realm. It was cold and quiet here, seeming illusory yet not illusory, seeming real yet not real. His gaze deepened. If there were no accidents, this should be within the divine will of the spirit of creation. At his level, if he fought with the Weili, he would also transmit Taoist techniques to each other when they collided. It was the same for a confrontation between divine wills. However, the divine wills were not as distinct as the Weili. You were you and I was still me. Here, there was me in you and there was you in me. He knew very well that the heavenly secrets were in chaos, and the laws of the great Tao were being sorted out. Before this ended, both sides could not use their Weili to fight. However, the battle between divine wills was not affected, so the spirit of creation had found him. This was not because he had seen the person in the divine will, but because the person had been prepared to do so. His thoughts turned. If he could enter the person's divine will, then the two ancestors, Hongho and Yaoan, would probably face the same situation. However, the contest between divine wills was not a Weili contest. There was no difference in who was stronger and who was weaker. It only depended on who could merge with the other. When they were being invaded by the spirit of creation, this person was also fighting against them in the same situation. Just as he was thinking, his heart moved. He felt someone standing behind him. His eyes flashed, but he did not turn back to look. Instead, he walked forward. The person behind him did the same action. It was obvious that the person's back was facing him. As he walked forward, both sides gradually moved apart. That person could be the reflection of the spirit of creation, or he could be himself. There was no need to delve too deeply into this. Otherwise, he would only fall into the trap of obsession. In the divine will, a slight thought would be reflected. Therefore, he could not have the slightest doubt here. In reality, as long as there was a beginning, the loophole would continue to be magnified. It was impossible to stop. Therefore, he had to stick to his heart. Otherwise, the spirit of creation might take advantage of the weakness and enter. Then, he would be assimilated and become a part of the person. This was a devouring in another sense. It was far more dangerous than fighting head-on. However, he was in the divine will of the spirit of creation. Similarly, under the exchange of divine wills, he was also in the human heart and human nature that he weaved. If the spirit of creation sank into it and gained the human heart and human nature, he would no longer be the spirit of creation. He would also have the hobbies and fears of living creatures, but at the same time he would abandon his original rigidity. It was difficult to say whether this was good or bad. Because the human heart was ever-changing, and there were thousands of people with thousands of faces. No one knew what the spirit of creation would become after obtaining this. At this moment he seemed to feel something. He looked up and saw a drop of water falling from an unreachable place. Then, it passed by his body and fell into a place that was infinitely deep. After a long time, ripples came from below. When the ripples stopped, another drop of water fell, and this repeated in a rigid and regular manner. The surrounding silence represented the stillness in this place, and this drop of water represented the movement in the stillness. Stillness, stillness, and destruction were the principles of the operation of the great Tao. However, at this moment, it was presented in the simplest and most refined way. This was not deliberately shown to him by the spirit of creation, but by his own choice. Those with shallow skills could only see the complicated laws and logos here, but he could choose for himself and only see the most fundamental side. He was deep in thought. Although he could not digest what he saw here, after he left, he could fill in the unknowns in his body and take another step towards the great Tao. Without a doubt, this confrontation was a battle of techniques, and at the same time, it was also the continuation of the fundamental reason for the competition between the two sides. He continued to walk forward. Suddenly, a ball of incomparably grand essence appeared in front of him. He looked over and immediately distinguished that this was the essence of creation before it shattered and dispersed. However, what the spirit of cultivation saw was the truth. Logically speaking, it was impossible for him to see the complete essence of creation. At least, he should be able to see signs of it shattering soon. However, after a long time, this item did not change at all. He looked for a moment and couldn't help but narrow his eyes. He had already guessed the person's thoughts. Right now, among all of them, only the spirit of creation and the three of them had the highest power of the great path. When their divine wills were mixed together, they could reflect part of the great path. The spirit of creation was borrowing their power in an attempt to recreate this scene in his divine will, or rather, to make a part of it appear again. Chapter 23:37. Zhang Yan looked at the essence of creation. After he sat on the chessboard, he had a conversation with the ancestors, and the main thing they mentioned was this item. What was the complete essence of creation? Some people believed that it was the ultimate person. Regardless of whether this was true or not, if one could see through all the mysteries, they would undoubtedly be able to reach this realm. However, what he was seeing now could only be considered a reflection of this thing. The complete essence of creation was perfect and flawless. It was neither moving nor static, and it pointed directly to the Grand Tao. Everything was under it, and it could be said to be everywhere. Before the essence of creation was broken, cultivators relied on this thing to climb to the higher realms. It could be said that this was a process of gradually getting closer to this thing from the outside in. In the beginning, cultivators were weak and couldn't see this thing. Only when they reached the higher realms and transcended the world could they sense it. This reaction was only a reaction to the Tao and not the essence of creation itself, because the essence itself was invisible. For example, when he reached the spirit refinement realm, the ball of light he saw was only an illusion created by the interaction between the inside and the outside, not the true essence of creation. Even when he reached the great virtue realm, before he reached the final Grand Tao, He would only see a part of it and would never be able to come into contact with it. It was no wonder that the various great virtues gave it spirituality back then. There was clearly a deeper level of consideration behind this. Since I can't see him, then let him come see me. However, while the various great virtues idea was not bad, they paid a great price. From their original goal, they had only half succeeded. They could see the grand Tao from the spirit of creation, and the spirit of creation could also use them to help themselves. Thus, the only way was to destroy the spirit of creation and obtain everything. Just now, they had completed their task. After thinking through all of this, the essence of creation before him wasn't worth paying too much attention to. This item might be extremely attractive to the spirit refinement realm, but for a great virtue like him, it was nothing more than this. Even if it was complete, he would still break it and remove the barrier blocking his path. Moreover, he dared to say with certainty that if he were to walk in this direction, he would never be able to arrive before that object. Even if he was able to accomplish it, that object would be destroyed because of this. Of course, the spirit of creation had recreated this object in its divine will. It might have wanted to throw the three of them, or even itself, into this furnace to fulfill itself. Even if they could not recover the complete essence of creation, they could still merge their divine wills into it. These two things were not contradictory. He took another look at the ball of magnificent brilliance. If he wanted to attract their divine wills, he had to at least display more of the great Tao's profundities. He privately deduced that as long as one of the three of them had a flaw in their minds, they would be able to push this thing to change. However, this situation was unlikely to happen. Not to mention him, the two founding ancestors had experienced a myriad of tempering in order to reach their current level. However, it was difficult for their hearts to be shaken by the current scene. Unless the creation spirit displayed the principles it knew and used it to attract them, then perhaps it would have a slight chance of being shaken. If that was the case, he was willing to experience it. This contest of divine will was completely instigated by the creation spirit. If it did not take the initiative to retreat, it would usually not end. However, similarly, as long as they did not get lost here, all the burdens would be completely thrown to them. The more they obtained here, the heavier their burdens would be. Just as he was thinking about this, the magnificent brilliance suddenly disappeared and turned into an empty space. There seemed to be nothing there, but when he carefully sensed it, it seemed to contain everything. His heart stirred slightly. The essence of creation in the eyes of every Almighty was different. If there was no mistake, this should be what the creation spirit sensed. He thought about it and smiled. Then, he shook his sleeves and floated over. At this moment, on the other side, the creation spirit was also immersed in a scene that he had never seen before. He had transformed into an expressionless green-robed scholar and was walking in the bustling world. Usually, the living beings in his eyes were just indistinct specks of dust that passed by in a flash, but now they truly appeared in front of him. His indifferent eyes reflected the people coming and going and the clamor of the mortal world. With a wave of his hand, everything suddenly sped up. The wind and clouds in the sky moved swiftly, and everything in the surroundings also changed rapidly. The river changed its course, the disaster of war and bandits broke out, and the crowd scattered. This place was completely turned into ruins. Then the flood overflowed, the land rose, the sun and the moon shifted, and the once prosperous land became a wasteland. The river of time continued to rush forward, and new people came to this place to build a city. Then they abandoned it. Everything in the mortal world continued to repeat itself, and it seemed that there would never be much change. When the evolution of the world finally came to an end, everything returned to silence. However, all of this did not end there. When he opened his eyes, he found that he had transformed into a baby who was not even a month old. He was being gently held in someone's arms and was gently rocking him. There was a soft hum in his ears. He stared with wide eyes at his parents who were trying to coax him to sleep. He felt the joy of being reborn and the vitality that was radiating from within his body. Soon he fell asleep. When he woke up again, he was already a young man. He got up when he heard the roosters crow. After drinking a bowl of hot porridge, he picked up the bag that he had already packed. Amidst the greetings of his fellow villagers, and under the earnest urging of his parents, he sat on the ox cart and went out to welcome the morning sun. His heart was filled with the apprehension of leaving his hometown and going to a strange place. In a trance, the scenery changed, and he became a young man who was studying hard in the night. The shadows of the trees outside the window danced, and gusts of cold wind blew in. He could only curl up his limbs and breathe in to keep warm. When his wife saw this, she silently put on a coat for him and handed him tea. After drinking a mouthful of hot tea, he grabbed his wife's hands and felt her warmth. His heart was filled with love, and he also had the desire to pass the imperial examinations, bring honor to his ancestors, and even earn a title for his wife. The scenery changed again. This time, he became a strong man with thick knuckles and a face full of hardships. He was working hard at carpentry. Every time he took off his handkerchief to wipe his sweat, his mind would be filled with the thought of giving his children a new set of clothes after he got his salary from the boss. Then he would use the remaining money to buy a new set of jewelry for his wife, whom he had been helping out with through thick and thin hardships. Thinking of this, his exhausted body would immediately gain some strength. Before the sound of sawing and chopping completely disappeared, he was already walking in the alley with the help of a walking stick. As an old man, his eyes and ears were not sharp, and his reaction to the outside world was abnormally slow. Only when the younger generation came to offer him sweets would a smile appear on his wrinkled face. After entering the haze under the eaves of a house, he found himself lying on a bed. This was an old and broken body, and his chest did not rise or fall at all. He felt his body aging and decaying like never before, and his thoughts became stiff and numb. Unknowingly, there was a bottomless darkness surging over and completely drowning him. The love and hate, the sorrow and bitterness, the joy and happiness of the human world, and all kinds of things, all came to an end and returned to silence. It seemed like an extremely long time, but it also seemed like a short moment. The spirit of creation experienced the life of mortals from birth to death, from prosperity to decline. What he saw was not some heavenly secret or truth, but a painting of the world. Just like how Zhang Yan and the two patriarchs saw the various mysteries of the divine will, these things were also reflected back to others. The divine wills of both sides were in the process of blending. No matter which side wavered, it would be assimilated by the other side. In order to avoid this, the spirit of creation only looked at everything from the perspective of a transcendent being. But just like what Zhang Yan had learned, he also had his own gains. He believed that the endless desire of mortals to improve actually came from fear. Fear of being attacked by the same kind, fear of the heaven and earth Wei, and even fear of the cycle of life and death. The more they feared, the more they wanted to fight against powerful forces. It was this fear that pushed the lowly mortals to climb to the top, vainly trying to transcend, and thus solve all the pain and difficulties. The spirit of creation's actions were all natural and followed the great Tao. If it believed that it could be done, then it would do so, and no human thoughts would be mixed in with it. But now, he realized that it was precisely because of the complex and ever-changing hearts of human path cultivators that they had more opportunities to touch the laws of fate. After understanding all of this, he first lowered his head. When he raised his head again, there seemed to be a trace of intelligence in his originally indifferent eyes. This was because he had deliberately added some mortal emotions. This did not mean that he had become a person with a human heart, nor would he do so. He only wanted to add some variables so that he could grasp the thread of fate that could decide the outcome of the battle. As Zhang Yan walked towards the good fortune essence, layers of marvelous truths were reflected in his mind. The exchange of divine wills didn't seem to be hindered at all. He simply rushed in. He didn't accept everything, but only left behind what he could. At this moment, his mind seemed to have become a stubborn stone. Under the impact of these impure currents, the old color faded, and it slowly became whole and new. Just as he was about to enter the creation essence, he felt his surroundings tremble and everything around him shattered. Zhang Yan looked up. Although he had experienced thousands of twists and turns in the divine will, in reality, it had only been a moment. At the same time, the eyes of Patriarch Yao Han and Patriarch Hong Ho also regained clarity. Patriarch Yao Han suddenly said, "The spirit of creation's chi activity is a little different." Patriarch Hong Ho said, "How can the fusion of divine wills not change?" Zhang Yan nodded slightly. The spirit of creation's chi activity was originally rigid and still, and could be considered emotionless. But now, there was a trace of change. It was no longer cold and indifferent, and it was obvious that it had obtained something. However, it could be seen that its nature had not changed. Of course, as to what exactly it was, he would have to see it in the next battle. Chapter 23:38. Zhang Yan asked the two patriarchs about their encounters in the divine will, and the results were similar. The two of them were also led to the place where the creation essence was, but in the end, they both escaped from the divine will. Clearly, they weren't confused by the creation essence. Patriarch Yao Han said, "In the past, when our fellow Taoists discussed the Tao, everyone believed that no matter who had a Tao, as long as one could derive it to the extreme, they would be able to invade the rest of the Tao and occupy all the great Taos. The spirit of creation probably knows this as well, so he lured me to enter it and complete his Tao. He saw that he couldn't seize our Tao arts on the chessboard, so he wanted to continue doing it in the divine decree." Patriarch Hong Ho said, "When he schemed against me, I schemed against him. There's no difference in strength between the Weili in the divine will, so it can be considered a fair contest." Zhang Yan also agreed with this statement. This was how the confrontation between divine wills worked. "If you want to steal my Tao, I can also steal your Tao." He pondered for a moment and said, "The spirit of creation has thrown out all of its Tao laws, but it can still use its own Tao law to resist me. It can be said that it has evolved a Tao law to the extreme." Patriarch Yao Han agreed, "If we can only place one piece on the chessboard of the great Tao, then his Tao should be able to withstand the momentum of several pieces." Zhang Yan nodded. However, the Tao of the spirit of creation was innately like this, and it wasn't something that could be obtained through one's own cultivation. In order to have such ability, it was completely because he had endured a portion of the remnant power left behind after the essence of creation shattered. As far as he knew, there wasn't a single great virtue that could cultivate a Tao to this level. Perhaps the great underworld patriarch was infinitely close to this level, or else he wouldn't have been able to lead the Weili to control the creation chi to suppress the creation spirit. The difficulty didn't just lie in one's own cultivation, but also in the fact that when one's Tao reached a certain level, it would inevitably leave more marks in the great Tao. Sometimes, it would invade other Taoists of the same Tao, and conflict would inevitably arise. Actually, from the perspective of the general trend of the Grand Tao, this was the correct path to seek the Tao. If one annihilated one's opponent, then one would naturally be able to seize the entire Tao art, whereas if one was annihilated, then everything would come to an end. If one compromised and gave in, then it would naturally be impossible for one to seek the Grand Tao. Even if there really was such a person in the past, that person would have long since been driven into silence by the joint forces of all the great virtue. As for mastering different Taoist techniques, although some Vedanta had tried to deduce them, before the essence of creation shattered, no one had ever succeeded. Until now, only Zhang Yan had succeeded. Thus, the Vedanta's choice was to walk the path of pure Taoism to the end. Therefore, drawing out the creation spirit was indeed a way to solve the problem once and for all. For the great virtues, as long as they got rid of this person, it would be equivalent to solving all their problems. In fact, he had a deduction here. Judging from Wei Ming's attempt to let the later ascended deity refinement cultivators replace him, maybe there was a great virtue who had the intention to seize the Tao arts from the later generations in order to possess several Tao arts. However, doing so would bring about great consequences, because once this precedent was set, in order not to fall behind, all the virtuous ones would follow suit. The worst-case scenario would be that those who came later would never be able to stand out. Every junior who ascended to this realm would become the resources of their predecessors, and the virtuous ones would no longer be able to focus on themselves. He had always felt that the great virtues had drawn out the creation essence a little too early. Even the patriarchs like Hong He, Yao Han, and Ling Yu had not reached the peak of pure Tao. If the great virtues had cultivated to the peak before bestowing the creation essence with a spirit, then they might have been able to suppress the creation spirit. Therefore, he suspected that the reason why they did such a thing before the time was right was probably because there was a Vedanta who wanted to prevent such a thing from happening. This way, they could both explore the Tao and perfectly avoid all internal disputes. His conjecture only existed in his heart. The two patriarchs did not say much about what happened before the essence of creation broke, so he did not ask further. No matter what the truth was, and no matter what the Vedanta thought back then, since it had already come to this, then they had to be the ones to settle the loose ends. At this time, his gaze turned and saw that Patriarch Yao Han was silent. He smiled and said, "Tao friend, do you have any problems?" Patriarch Yao Han thought about it and said, "Just now, it is not that I did not gain anything from the divine will, but I am unable to determine the pros and cons. Since Tao friend has asked, I am willing to let Tao friend have a look." Zhang Yan smiled and said, "Thank you, Tao friend." In the divine will, everyone saw different things. Perhaps they could get something useful from it. Ancestral Master Yao Han used his divine will to transmit what he saw to Zhang Yan. He then looked at Ancestral Master Hong He and asked, "Tao friend, do you want to see it?" Patriarch Hong He shook his head and said, "I don't need it." Just now, it was not that he did not see some changes of the creation spirit in the divine will, but he had discarded them all. The Tao that he had always adhered to was only the sword. He had never thought of accepting the Tao of others, nor would he observe these things. At this moment, Zhang Yan was indescribable. Through Patriarch Yao Han's transmission, he had indeed seen some things that he had not come into contact with in the divine will. As the latter said, it was hard to know if the creation spirit had deliberately leaked it or if it had been inadvertently obtained by Patriarch Yao Han. It was hard to tell for a moment, and after some deductions, he fell into deep thought. At this moment, he suddenly felt something. He found that the heavenly secrets were gradually calming down, and the rules of the great Tao were about to be transferred back. Most importantly, the Wei Qi activity of the creation spirit had also reappeared in his senses. It was not difficult for him to sense that the Qi activity of the creation spirit was currently rising. This should have been caused by him forcibly withdrawing from the great Tao chessboard, and he was still recovering. He smiled and said, "Just now, the creation spirit attacked me with the divine will, and now it's time for me to return the favor." He looked at Patriarch Hong He and said, "This is a rare opportunity, Tao friend. Can you make a move?" Patriarch Hong He agreed and said, "Wait for me to slash." As he spoke, he pointed with his fingers and slashed with sword qi. At this moment, the rules of the great Tao had not been completely restored, but he could already make some changes. His sword technique followed the changes, passing through the layers of obstacles and directly slashed at the creation spirit. The creation spirit had already sensed the sword coming, but his Wei Li was too strong. Before the rules of the great Tao were fixed, it was very likely that he would suffer more losses if he forcefully resisted an external force. Thus, he forcefully endured the sword, and a layer of his Qi activity Wei Li was shaved off. However, with the huge size of his Wei Li, the damage caused to him was extremely small. However, the purpose of this sword was not to kill, but to stop the recovery of his Wei Li so that he could gain an advantage before the two of them truly clashed. After Patriarch Hong He slashed with his sword, he did not stop, and very quickly he followed up with another sword. His sword technique was a Tao technique, so in reality, this was a battle between Tao techniques. It was impossible to deal with before the Tao was broken, but to be safe, this sword was completely different from the previous one. Next, he consecutively slashed over 10 times. As the rules of the great Tao became more stable, his sword momentum, whether it was the changes or the degree of profoundness, were all better than the previous one. In the beginning, the spirit of creation was passively receiving the attacks, but as he observed the sword technique several times, no matter how it changed, it would be deduced by the profoundness of the Tao technique and block them one by one. However, the goal of the great virtues side was also achieved. Under the disturbance of the Wei Li, its qi activity still could not return to its original state. However, at the moment when the rules of the Great Tao were about to be restored, the Weili suddenly launched a counterattack. In an instant, Zhang Yan and the other two felt an unprecedented heavy pressure coming at them. Patriarch Hong He and Patriarch Yao Han both had solemn expressions. After going through the power of calamity and even fighting against the great virtue, the creation spirit's current ability had already far surpassed the essence of creation. Just now, when it shattered, although they were also different from then, the gap between them did not shrink because of this. At this moment, Zhang Yan took a step forward, clenched his fist, and slammed it horizontally. In the collision, his sleeves fluttered endlessly. The heavy encirclement was smashed by him, and all the obstacles were swept away. He looked up and saw that the creation spirit was shrouded in light, and it was also looking at him. This was the second time he faced the creation spirit head-on after playing the Great Tao chessboard. Previously, when the creation spirit was trapped by the power of calamity, an avatar had landed and attacked him once. However, at that time, most of its power was still trapped by the power of calamity. Now, it could be said that this avatar was completely unharmed. He did not use the power of Bushutian and only used the power of the Tao of Strength to block its attack. Seeing that its attack had been blocked, the creation spirit's body shone brightly. In the next moment, endless light shone, as if it could pierce into one's soul. As for Zhang Yan, with a thought, the 5 rays of light behind him swayed and absorbed all of the rays of light. This was purely a battle of qi and dermic powers. As the mighty powers fused and collided, there was an instant when he suddenly felt as if he had gone to another world. He also saw that there were still many imperfections in his Tao, and it seemed like he could only make up for them by defeating this opponent. But at this moment he suddenly felt that his Weili was decreasing bit by bit. He knew that this was the power of the Tao of the creation spirit, and it could devour the Weili of the great virtue. This was also one of the reasons why few great virtues could fight it head-on. The reason why such a thing didn't happen when he used the path of strength to face his enemy was because he had completely obtained the path of strength. Moreover, when he faced his enemy, it was straightforward and didn't merge with each other. No matter what kind of transformation his opponent had, as long as his opponent's level wasn't completely above his, he would be able to smash his opponent into pieces. At this time, the solemn warning of Ancestor Yao Han came through the divine will. Fellow Taoist, be careful when you come down. Zhang Yan nodded, and the light in his eyes deepened. Just now was purely a collision of Weili. The true power of the creation spirit did not lie in this, but in the transformation of the Tao. It was just that none of the opponents he had met in the past were worthy of this, and he only needed to crush them with pure Weili. So next, he was afraid that he would have to experience a method that no one had seen before. Chapter 2339. Zhang Yan knew that the more profound one's Tao, the more changes there would be. In the past, when he faced enemies, even Vedanta, he only learned a single Tao, and because it was far from the true Tao, it was much easier to deduce and decipher it. The spirits of creation were different. Their Tao techniques were profound, and they were probably only a step away from the great Tao. They could easily pry into the secrets of various Tao techniques. So, at the very least, they had to be treated as a great virtue that possessed several Tao techniques. He looked at this great enemy that he had never seen before, and his fighting spirit rose. Ever since he had transcended the world, he had rarely met such a powerful opponent, not to mention that the other party was the only obstacle in his path to the Tao. If he could defeat him, he would be able to step into the upper realm and wield the Tao. Just as he was thinking about it, he suddenly felt a change in the qi activity on the other side. Several bright lights shot out from inside, heading towards where the 3 of them were. Soon, they penetrated the depths of the 3's mighty force. It could be said that they were extremely sharp. With a thought, he flicked his finger, and the light bomb in front of him dissipated. Unexpectedly, its power was so weak that it could not even be considered as a disturbance. However, he did not look down on it. Even if the spirit of creation had a slight change in his human nature, it was just him changing on his own. As long as his foundation did not waver, he would not do anything useless. There must be a purpose here. Moreover, he also found that this method was very similar to Patriarch Hongho's sword technique. At this moment, the two patriarchs had also easily withstood the attack. However, both of them also revealed looks of surprise. Patriarch Yao Han stretched out his hand, and his divine will transmitted, "Fellow Taoist Hongho, is this the Tao you practice?" Patriarch Hongho said, "Yes, the spirit of creation is invading my Tao in an attempt to cut off my path." Vedanta only occupied one Tao, but it did not mean that the Tao was occupied. Outsiders could still come in and seize it, but it depended on the strength of the two sides. Now, the spirit of creation had clearly observed the changes in Patriarch Hongho's sword Tao, so it came to seize the Tao. This did not mean that the spirit of creation valued this Tao, but that it felt the threat of this sword Tao to itself, so it wanted to get rid of it. There was nothing more effective than attacking the source. Founding ancestor Yao Han's expression turned solemn as he asked, "Tao friend, is there something wrong here?" Patriarch Hongba's aura grew sharper and he said loudly, "It's fine. If he can take this technique, I'm willing to fight him." He had always focused on the Tao, and the emotional imprints that were imprinted in the great Tao could be said to be difficult to erase. Perhaps in terms of breadth, it could not be compared to the spirit of creation, but in terms of depth, it was not something that others could compare to. The only regret was that his Weili level had always been increasing, but his Tao had not improved for a long time. If the spirit of creation was really able to occupy a Tao art, then it meant that this person's comprehension in this Tao art was even deeper than his own. If it was like this, then he would surely head over and experience it. As the saying goes, seeking the Tao in the morning can die in the evening. As long as he could hear the Shang Dao true technique, he would not hesitate even if he was banished to eternal silence. Just as the bright light fell, a loud voice rang out from the other side. It seemed to come from high above, grand and melodious. Along with this voice, a golden light spread out from the feet of the three and went all the way to the top of their heads, as if it was going to cover them very soon. Founding ancestor Yao Han raised his hand to block it, and brilliant starlight surged out, driving the golden light away. He pondered for a moment and said, "This should be the question of Tao names. We cannot answer it or else it will take away our Tao art." Founding ancestor Hongba waved his sleeve, and sword chi washed away the light. Zhang Yan did not move, but before the light could spread to his body, it seemed to be unable to reach it, and its body dissipated. He thought for a moment, and said, "The question of Tao names should be Taoist Xiang Ming's Tao art. This person can distinguish the foundation of the people in the world, and then carry out various changes on it. For example, that booming voice wasn't so simple. It was constantly fighting against your Tao art, and the slightest bit of carelessness would allow it to invade your foundation. When that voice spoke the name of your foundation, your Tao art would naturally be seized by it. It was not strange for the spirit of creation to make such a change. Although it had no choice but to abandon all the Tao techniques, it had devoured these Tao techniques before, after all. It was not difficult for it to make some shallow use of them. Just like the Tao arts that he had inherited before, he also needed to have some understanding before he could place a piece on the chessboard. However, the elephant name Tao art wasn't a secret to him. Before the tribulation energy was destroyed, Wei Ming and Wei Ming had revealed all their Tao arts to him for the sake of inspecting themselves. So he knew the changes within it in great detail. It was practically impossible for the creation spirit to use this method against it. However, he believed that things were not so simple. As long as one knew the power of this Tao art, even ordinary Dada would not be able to easily block it, let alone him and the two ancestors. Therefore, the main target here was not them, but somewhere else. Everything has a Tao art. They can choose not to respond, but all things will respond. As long as there are enough responses, the name of the foundation will be grasped by the spirit of creation, and the spirit of creation will be able to make that thing his own. Now, there are very few things that are worthy of the spirit of creation's attention, so he did not need to think too much to know where the spirit of creation's target was. He turned his gaze and looked at Bu Shutian, only to see a boundless hand reaching in this direction. The Weili is originally invisible, but once it falls into the light of the De, it will turn into different shapes. This is the reflection of the mind of the owner of the Weili. At this moment, seeing this hand in front of him represents the intention to take it, which means that the spirit of creation wants to take Bu Tian this time. Just now, the spirit of creation has not succeeded on the chessboard, so it wants to take this thing outside of the chessboard. Of course, seizing was divided into feigned seizing and actual seizing. If the owner of the mighty forces Dao technique was above the opponents, then he would be able to make many changes in his mind and thus hide his original thoughts. However, in this case, it was only the method of seizing that was different. Zhang Yan changed his mind. It was not a good idea to directly deal with the Dao art. Even if he was the owner of Bu Tian and could use its power, Bu Tian was not a cultivator and could not resist the Dao art. Unless he could change Bu Tian's foundation, then he could avoid it. However, if he were to change his strength here, his opponent would also be able to respond accordingly. This way, he would be led away by his opponent, and the trouble would never be solved. Therefore, it was not feasible to be passive. The only correct way was to counterattack. Thinking of this, he did not care what method the spirit of creation used. He took a step forward and threw a punch at the spirit of creation. A frontal attack was always the most honorable method. The most important thing was that the method to resolve the strength Dao was actually very simple. One just needed to surpass the opponent in terms of power. The strong was the strong, the weak was the weak. There was no other reasoning. However, because it was simple, it was also the most difficult to resolve. Here, he not only used the power of the strength Dao, but also the Bu Tian's Weili. Under the combination of these two forces, the flow of the Dao almost stopped for a moment. The spirit of creation seemed to have fallen into a state of stillness. However, at the last moment, his body shined brightly and he raised his hand to block the punch. Boom! The spirit of creation's entire body was shattered by the punch, turning into countless specks of light that dissipated. Within the Bu Tian, Dan Yi was sitting in the temple and watching the battle. Due to luck, he had not been banished into eternal silence, but due to his own cultivation he could not participate in this battle. Thus, he could only fall into the Bu Tian and use the Weili to conceal himself. However, he did not do nothing. He had been watching the battle and did his best to transmit what he saw to the various worlds. With his efforts, as long as one was a cultivator, they would be able to watch the battle between the two sides. However, compared to the spirit of creation and the Vedanta, his Weili was too weak and could not fully understand the mysteries of this battle. Thus, the scene he saw was very blurry. And just now, when he saw Zhang Yan's punch land, before he could see the result, he suddenly felt something strange in his heart. He unconsciously looked over and saw the spirit of good fortune turn around. Its gaze pierced through the endless world and landed on him. Danny was startled and then felt a bit dazed. When he regained consciousness, he found that the spirit of creation had appeared before him. He slowly stood up and said as if he was facing a great enemy, "What are you doing here?" The spirit of creation's body was covered in a mass of light. He did not speak and only stood there quietly. However, Dan Yi could somehow sense his intentions. He shook his head, cupped his hands, and said solemnly, "I know that my clan was originally separated from your esteemed self, but I have my own Dao intent and will. I am not on the same path as your esteemed self." After he finished speaking, he seemed to have heard something. He raised his head and looked straight at the spirit of creation. He still said firmly, "I am a cultivator of the human path. I have never been a spirit from beyond the heavens. Please forgive me for not being able to accept your invitation." The spirit of creation looked at him and suddenly raised his hand. Then he slowly reached out to grab him. Danny felt his entire body grow heavy as a boundless pressure gushed over him. At this moment, he actually couldn't move at all. Even the mighty energy in his body no longer obeyed his commands. He could only watch helplessly as his opponent moved. However, his expression was calm. Just as he said, even if he was banished into silence, he would not change his mind because of this. At this moment, there was a rumble. The spirit of creation in front of him suddenly broke apart and then turned into nothingness. Zhang Yan's incarnation slowly withdrew his fist and stood in the air with his sleeves behind his back. Dan Yi immediately felt that his restraints had been lifted. He hurried forward and bowed, saying, "Fellow Xinyuan, thank you for saving me." Zhang Yan's incarnation shook his head and smiled. "Fellow Xinyuan, there is no need to thank me. The spirit of creation has come looking for your foundation. If your heart had been shaken, even if I had taken action, you would have been used by the spirit of creation." When he finished speaking, his figure drifted away like smoke. Danny looked up and saw that in the silence, there were pieces of spiritual light left by the spirit of creation after it broke apart. Chapter 2340. Inside Bu Su Tian, Fu Qingming and the other true Yang experts were also watching the battle. When they saw the spirit of creation being destroyed by Zhang Yan's fist, their spirits were lifted. Michihito Ichido was also a guest in by Luo Tian. He stood up when he saw the situation, but he quickly calmed down. He shook his head and sat down again. Clearly, he also realized that the spirit of creation was not so easy to deal with. Fu Qingming said, "Fellow Taoist, don't be impatient. Even if the spirit of creation did not lose, it seems that the Vedantas have their own ways to restrain him." Taoist Yi nodded and said, "That's right. Grand Elder Xinyuan was able to force the spirit of creation to such a state. Even if we didn't kill this person, our human path's chances of winning are not small." The two of them conversed with the other true Yang cultivators. They had the same opinion, and because they could not understand the various changes in the Daos, they could only rely on the battle to deduce the situation. At this moment, all the cultivators in the universe felt their spirits rise when they saw this scene. After all, this battle concerned the rise and fall of the human Tao and the survival of all living beings. Although the spirit of creation had never said what it would do to all living beings, its indifferent attitude towards them was enough to make people view it as an enemy. Moreover, when cultivators looked at it, they instinctively felt like they were being devoured. This was undoubtedly telling them that this person was born to be their enemy. This was indeed the case. After the spirit of creation devoured all the Vedantas, not only did it obtain their Daos, but it also freed itself from the Qi of creation. The last step was naturally to devour Bu Su Tian and refine him into the essence of creation. This time, with his spirituality as the main body, he could consciously control the great Tao. Amidst the silence, Zhang Yanzheng also sensed the changes in Bu Shutian's body. The creation spirit should have also sensed that Bu Shutian was too great of a threat after joining forces with him, so it had set its sights on this item. It had done something to Dan Yi before, so it took advantage of this opportunity to make a move. If Dan Yi had truly obeyed or cooperated with him under duress, then he would have had a chance. However, he had already made his preparations. As soon as Dan Yi showed himself, he would be easily destroyed. At this moment, he looked at the battlefield. Although he had shattered the spirit of creation with a single punch, when the person used the way of names, his conjured body was no longer important. What appeared to the outside world was only a shell that contained his way names. Only by hitting his way names could he destroy his conjured body. However, that punch was not without damage. After all, as long as it was hit, it could not escape unscathed. Su Tian could not escape unscathed. Otherwise, the spirit of Tian would not need to defend just Su Tian. But what was strange was why the spirit of Yang had used someone else, Tao, against them. Why did it not use its own Tao? Was it because it had not recovered from the damage it had suffered on the Great Path chessboard just now, so it did not use it, or was there some other arrangement? He thought about it. If it was the latter, then it must be someone trying to arrange something. This was a very high possibility. Thinking of this, he immediately made some deductions in his divine will. However, he noticed that the secrets of the heavens that represented the spirit of creation were extremely chaotic, and it was extremely difficult to calculate. He understood that this ought to be the spirit of creation avoiding it, and it even utilized a Tao art of great virtue. It was indistinct, and it was extremely difficult to find a clue. He analyzed it and found that this Tao was very similar to what Xiangju had originally practiced. His heart skipped a beat, and he reached out to grab at the scattered light. With a loud rumble, a mighty force pressed down on the scattered light. Since it was difficult to find the exact location of the light, then he would attack the scattered light. This was also the mighty force of the spirit of creation. Even if he couldn't heavily injure the person, he could still delay their recovery. He was able to discern that the spirit of creation had already used most of its strength to deal with him. However, it seemed to have forgotten something. He wasn't the only one fighting the spirit of creation. Even if the two founding ancestors were inferior to him in strength, the Tao techniques in their possession weren't just for show. After the spirit of creation attacked, Patriarch Hongba no longer attacked. Instead, he stood to the side and closed his eyes, as if he was sensing something. At that moment, his eyes widened, and the aura around his body suddenly rose. Just as this sharpness reached its peak, it suddenly retracted, as if it had hidden its sharpness. However, the sword intent that could cut through everything was reflected in the minds of everyone present. Even founding ancestor Yao Han was dazed for a moment. When he came back to his senses, he was shocked to realize that the sword had already slashed out. On the spirit of creation side, its Tao name had been hidden, and it had used other methods to conceal it, so it should have been fine. However, at that moment, the sword chi fell and directly hit its core. Patriarch Hongba's sword was a clever use of his own Tao. This sword did not ask where its target was or who it was. As long as it pointed at its target with its mind, it would definitely hit its target. The most amazing thing about this sword was that the sword would rise and fall with its mind. With a single thought, the spirit of creation would be hit, so it could not dodge at all. If there was a weakness here, it would be that the sword did not have much lethality. However, that was not Patriarch Hongba's goal. It was purely to point out the spirit of creation's Tao name to Zhang Yan. Zhang Yan knew that the two grandmasters would not sit idly by and do nothing. They would definitely make their move according to the changes in the battle situation. Therefore, he had only been restraining the creation spirit from the front and did not care about anything else. Now, as expected, Grandmaster Hongba had created an opportunity with his sword. If everything went smoothly, it was very possible that he could force this great enemy into a dead end. If the spirit of creation wanted to ask for the Tao name of any object, it would first have to find a place for its Tao name before it could do so. However, if its Tao name was exposed and then completely destroyed by its opponent, it would mean that its core had been taken away. This meant that the person would lose everything, no matter who it was. There were weaknesses in every Tao method, and they could be targeted. However, the deeper one was immersed in the Tao method, the harder it would be for others to find it. If Xiang Ming was here, no matter how ingenious Patriarch Hongba's sword was, he would not be able to immediately find the deepest root of it. The spirit of creation had never mastered this Tao, and it only used it in the most superficial way. Therefore, under this sword, it was immediately exposed. At this moment, Zhang Yan did not hesitate at all. He punched the root, but at this moment, the spirit of creation's chi suddenly changed. Although his power had hit that place and destroyed most of its foundation, there was still a small part that was not affected. His gaze flickered slightly as he'd noticed something was off as well, and he'd deduced with his divine will that the radiant Tao art was utilized here. This technique followed the principle of the weak can't defeat the strong, and the strong can't defeat the weak. Under the protection of this technique, even if the strength of his punch was able to disperse the force within it, it was unable to completely destroy it. Earlier he'd observed the Tao art that was vaguely enlightened, and he knew that this sort of change wasn't everything. After this, there was still the change of weak is great, great 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 is great is great, great is great is great, great is 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 great. In other words, under the impetus of this technique, even if the spirit of creation was forced to its limits, so long as it didn't perish, then it would be able to immediately recover to its original state. This was actually the entire essence of the Tao of Wei Ming. However, in reality, even Wei Ming herself was unable to use the latter transformation. She was even on the path of pursuing this Tao. This was because this technique did not rely on transformation to obtain victory, and it completely depended on the level of strength of the person using the technique. Moreover, the spirit of creation possessed the Weili that almost no one could compare to, so it was naturally able to easily develop this technique. Zhang Yan raised his brows. At this moment, if it was any other great virtue here, then it would probably be an unsolvable deadlock when faced with such a situation. Because if the spirit of creation always relied on this technique, then it would be impossible for it to be defeated by others. However, it was not the case for him. The Tao of creation had always been the simplest and most direct. If one punch could not deal with it, then he would just use another punch. Even if the spirit of creation could return every time after being attacked like this, it would not be able to return perfectly every time. Moreover, after being held up like this, it would be impossible for it to do anything else. On the other hand, he still had two fellow Taoists by his side, and it was enough for him to continue searching for an opportunity to win during this process. Thinking up to there, he threw another punch at the spirit of creation, which had just recovered its power. After founding ancestor Hongba slashed out just now, he stood there without moving. It seemed like he had comprehended something, and after a long time, his chi suddenly surged, and his Tao technique abruptly increased by a level. Seeing this, founding ancestor Yao Han sighed slightly and transmitted his divine will. I have to congratulate fellow Taoist. With their realm, every step forward was extremely difficult. Who would have thought that founding ancestor Hongba would make another breakthrough in the midst of battle? Zhang Yan also sensed the changes in founding ancestor Hongba, but he did not find it strange. Founding ancestor Hongba's sword technique was completely born for battle, and it didn't primarily rely on cultivation and deduction. The more formidable the opponent he came into contact with, the more his comprehension of Tao arts would increase, whereas the spirits of creation could be said to be his strongest opponent, so he would naturally be able to improve as he fought with them. Moreover, this battle was a battle for the Tao. It was both a fight for victory and a pursuit of the Tao. Previously, when they fought with the tribulation power, they could improve their Weili, so wasn't it natural for them to have such a breakthrough now? At this moment, founding ancestor Hongba said through the divine will, "Fellow Taoists, just now, I have comprehended something again, and I might be able to break through the spirit of creation's defense." After asking a few questions, Zhang Yan found out that founding ancestor Hongba had comprehended a sword technique that could directly cut through the Tao technique of the opponent. However, this also depended on the opponent's mastery of the Tao technique. If it was still weak, like the Tao technique of the spirit of creation, then it was highly possible for him to succeed. Founding ancestor Yao Han thought for a moment and said, "Perhaps I can help fellow Taoist here." Then he also explained his thoughts. After listening, Zhang Yan made a prompt decision and said, "In that case, I will naturally restrain the spirit of creation from the front. Fellow Taoists, feel free to do whatever you want. Please remember this book's domain name. 9 Heavens Godly Emperor Mobile Version website." Chapter 2341. Founding ancestor Yao Han raised his hand, and as his sleeves fluttered, it was as if the world had come back to life. Billions of stars floated out from behind him, but the brilliance was still. It was obvious that he was accumulating power. There was no doubt that his next move would be astonishing. He had caused such a great commotion, so the spirit of creation had naturally noticed it. However, he was currently facing Zhang Yan's powerful and ferocious attacks. Every single punch was able to shatter the power he had gathered once again, causing him to be delayed here. Before this matter was resolved, he clearly knew that it would be inappropriate to ignore it, but he did not have the spare strength to go and stop it. Founding ancestor Yao Han did not know the exact situation the spirit of creation was in, but it was best to underestimate the enemy. This person had an endless number of tricks up his sleeve, so it was not an exaggeration to overestimate him. Founding ancestor Hongho also drew a line with his fingers, and a sword light leaped out from his fingertips. This sword strike required all of the Weili's chi, and it could be said that it contained the most profound understanding of one's Tao. As such, when it was condensed, it would cause quite a commotion. Fortunately, Founding Ancestor Yao Han's momentum was to conceal everything, so there was no need to worry that it would be exposed prematurely. Founding Ancestor Yao Han saw that he was ready, so he followed the plan just now. He raised his hand, and the endless stars shone down on the spirit of creation. It was not that the spirit of creation was completely defenseless against the two founding ancestors. However, he had miscalculated, and it was impossible for him to easily extricate himself from this passive situation without any additional help. The stars shone down. At first, there was no change, and the Whaley's chi was not damaged in the slightest. But soon, when his body was shattered by Zhang Yan's punch, the scattered power no longer returned to the original body. He could clearly sense that the Whaley seemed to have developed a spirit of their own, and were no longer willing to return. Clearly, this was the result of founding ancestor Yao Han's Tao. As long as the starlight continued to shine, this situation would continue for a long time. Moreover, if the power was not recalled in time, the Whaley would become a separate entity after a long time without the support of the starlight, forever separating from the main body. Zhang Yan secretly nodded. Although this move was not a tyrannical and sharp attack, the damage it caused to the spirit of creation was greater. As long as the person could not break free, then the body would become weaker and weaker. Once the person's main body was dealt with, the scattered power was nothing to be afraid of. At that time, he only needed to destroy it one by one. After the spirit of creation sensed these unfavorable circumstances, every time the Whaley gathered, it had no choice but to be even more careful so that its strength wouldn't easily disperse. But as a result, a portion of its energy was also tied up. Ancestral Master Hongbo had already prepared his sword momentum after using his chi to push it forward. He had not made his move earlier because he was looking for a suitable opportunity. He stared at the battlefield for a long time. With a thought, the sword ray on his finger suddenly disappeared. This sword was first hidden among the billions of streams of stars, and when it got close to its target, it suddenly shot out and struck the spirit of creation. Just now, the spirit of creation sensed that something was wrong, and the sword had already pierced into the divine chi. At that moment, he discovered that all his understanding and comprehension of the Tao of dimming, and even the profundities of circulating power, had been completely wiped away. Not a single bit was left. This sword was a sword that could break laws. If one was struck by this sword, then it could directly cut off the Tao that the opponent was using. If the spirit of creation's comprehension towards dimming Tao arts surpassed founding ancestor Hongbo's comprehension towards the sword Tao, then it was very likely for founding ancestor Hongbo's sword strike to be unable to accomplish anything. Yet now, this superficial utilization of the spirit of creation had been seized away on the spot. Most importantly, it was naturally impossible for him to recover as easily as he had in the past after losing this Tao art. Zhang Yan seized the opportunity and took advantage of the moment when the spirit of creation was unable to turn around to punch at the place where the spirit of creation was. Before he could hit the person, he felt a mysterious feeling arise in his heart. He narrowed his eyes. This was undoubtedly the spirit of creation using the chi of creation. It seemed like he couldn't do anything to it this time. However, he didn't feel much pity. He knew very well that this person wouldn't be destroyed so easily. Even if he didn't use the chi of creation, there would definitely be other methods to avoid this attack. It was just that the price he had to pay would be large and small. Now that he was able to force out this wisp of chi, even if he couldn't heavily injure it, he could eliminate a variable in advance. But after an instant, the mysterious feeling disappeared. Obviously, this wisp of chi of creation was only able to block the strength of his attack. The spirit of creation took advantage of this break to recover most of its Whaley chi. As for the remaining bit, it was still scattered outside due to ancestral Master Yao Han's method, and it was difficult to gather it in a hurry. Zhang Yan smiled and clenched his fist. When his sleeves fluttered, he punched out again. It wasn't easy to force the spirit of creation into this situation. He only managed to do this because he found a flaw. If he let the spirit of creation unleash its full strength, he might be able to block it, but ancestral Master Yao Han and Hongbo might not be able to use much of their strength. Therefore, what he needed to do now was to restrain the spirit of creation's main force so that the two ancestral masters would be free from the restraints and use their own methods. However, unexpectedly, when he punched out this time, the stubborn resistance that he imagined didn't appear. It was as if there was nothing left where the spirit of creation was. It was empty and there was nothing there. After he punched in with his power, the spirit of creation turned into reality. His eyes moved slightly. This was clearly the Tao method that Ing Kong originally used. If he used this method to fight against an enemy, no matter what method the enemy used, he could use this so-called empty space method to contain it. If it was only this Tao method, it would be easy to deal with. As long as he was fast enough, even if Ing Kong himself came over, he wouldn't be able to make another transformation. However, things weren't that simple. The spirit of creation still hid another type of Tao technique. Under his divine will's deduction, he quickly determined that this Tao technique was the Tao of perseverance. As the saying went, perseverance is the state of mind, and comprehension is everlasting clarity. The first aspect of this art was permanence. If he was attacked, he would be able to maintain it for a while. The second aspect was enlightenment. If he suffered great damage from an attack, then as long as the owner of the Tao law could still rotate, when he was attacked by the same Tao law a second time, the damage would definitely be less than the first time, and so on. This meant that if he kept using the Tao of strength to attack this person, and as long as he didn't destroy him, once this went on for a long time, the Tao of strength would no longer have any power to kill him. Hung Wu himself didn't use this Tao method to a high level. He was also one of the Vedanta who didn't like to fight. Especially after his opponent knew about the profoundness of his Tao method, he wouldn't have the chance to accumulate it at all. Therefore, there were very few people who were willing to come into contact with him. Regardless of whether it was Ing Kong or Heng Wu's Tao method, if it was just one, even if he was facing an opponent who had the same cultivation as him, he could only save himself for a while or gain the upper hand. However, when these two Tao methods were combined, it gave people a feeling that they didn't know where to start. After Zhang Yan saw through the profoundness of this, he pondered for a while. However, he didn't have any scruples because of this and maintained his original attack. If he was fighting alone, perhaps he would choose to change his strategy. However, after careful comparison, before the spirit of creation obtained the ability to resist the Tao method of strength, the situation it faced was actually not much different from just now. It was still the one being suppressed. Therefore, what he needed to do now was to continue maintaining this momentum so that the two Grandmasters would have more chances to attack. It was especially so for Grandmaster Hongba. He only needed to swing his sword, and he would be able to take away a Tao skill. As long as no one stopped him from wielding his sword, no matter how many creation spirits there were, he would be able to kill them all with one strike. He explained his plan to the two patriarchs through the divine will. Finally, he said, "The chi of creation has fallen into the all that has. We can't let the spirit of creation find it again. I'll have to trouble you too." Patriarch Yao Han said, "Leave this matter to us." At this moment, all the pressure on the battlefield was shouldered by Zhang Yan, so he could attack at will. The change in the chi of creation was to block Zhang Yan's attack. After that instant, it appeared again and was now floating in the void. With a flick of his sleeve, it was collected. Zhang Yan also had the fortune aura in his hands, but even though this aura was ever-changing, he wouldn't use it unless he was completely confident. It would be fine if he couldn't kill his opponent, but if he failed and his opponent managed to absorb the aura, it would only add more variables to the situation. Perhaps there would be a time when he could use it, but he didn't need it to fight for an opportunity now. Without external suppression, the two patriarchs could focus on manipulating the Weili. Patriarch Yao Han controlled the brilliant star stream and shone through the all that has. He kept stripping the spirit of creation of the Weili and bestowing spirituality to it. Patriarch Hongba kept manipulating the Qi and Will Dao. When he was done, he slashed with his sword. This slash directly cut through the art of perseverance. With that, Zhang Yan didn't have to worry about anything anymore. He could be said to be completely unrestrained, and his attacks were clearly stronger than just now. With the three of them working together, the battle gradually tilted in Dada's favor. Even though the spirit of creation kept sending out Tao techniques, it was not enough to turn the situation around. Just as Patriarch Hongba cut down the last Tao technique, the spirit of creation's Tao technique, Zhang Yan's eyes flashed. He gathered all the magic power in his body and punched the fundamental Tao name of the spirit of creation. In an instant, everything seemed to stop. After a long time, the three of them sensed a tremor from the depths of their minds. The spirit of creation and all the Wei fell into silence. Patriarch Yao Han and Patriarch Hongba immediately sensed the surroundings. There was no longer any trace of the spirit of creation. The two of them looked at each other. Could it be that this great enemy had been eliminated just like that? Chapter 23:42. Zhang Yan first sensed it carefully, and then his consciousness went through everything again, not letting go of any corner. Then he restored the scene of the battle just now in his divine will. Under the situation where he did not deliberately use it, even the figure of the spirit of creation could not be reflected. All of these proved that he had indeed driven the spirit of creation into eternal silence, and that fundamental Tao name could not be faked. This time, they had indeed won the battle. However, although these could prove that his view was correct, there was still something wrong here. Even without inference, one could see it at a glance. The spirit of creation was also a person who inherited the Tao. Since it was driven into eternal silence, then its fundamental Tao technique should have been revealed. Even if it could not be seen by them, it would definitely return to the great Tao and would not remain silent. He could be sure that at the last moment, the spirit of creation did not use any Tao technique, nor did it have the time to do so. Apart from that, there was another very unreasonable thing here. From the beginning to the end, the spirit of creation had not revealed its own fundamental Tao technique. He thought to himself, but what if the spirit of creation had made a move before this? When would that be? Was it when he played the great Tao chessboard, or was it earlier? Thinking of this, he calculated again, but he did not find any traces of Tao technique changes during the battle just now. His eyes flickered slightly, and he felt that he had overlooked something. If he could not find the result in a place where he could sense it, it undoubtedly meant that the mystery of this matter was in a place where he could not sense it. With this thought, he first greeted the two patriarchs, then raised his head and looked up. The Qi Wei on his body continued to rise, and when it reached the peak, he took a step forward. In an instant, he had already entered the long river of the Great Tao. After a brief identification, he walked towards the end of the Great Tao. Inside Busushan, Dan Yi saw that the light representing the spirit of creation had completely disappeared. He couldn't help but stand up and stare at the scene. Seeing this scene, Huan Tong couldn't help but feel excited, but he quickly suppressed it. He waited for a while and saw that the creation spirit didn't appear again. He looked at Dan Yi and saw that Dan Yi didn't speak, so he said, "Friend, was the creation spirit destroyed by the great virtues?" Dan Yi took a deep breath and said, "I can feel that the Wei binding me has disappeared. The spirit of creation has really disappeared." He paused for a moment and said with some hesitation, "But I have a feeling that something is wrong." Huan Tong said, "Fellow Taoist, with our cultivation realms, there's no way we could have sensed something like this. Perhaps something has changed here." He looked into the silence, and his expression became solemn again. He said, "The three great virtues haven't let their guard down either. It seems that things won't end so easily." After Zhang Yan entered the long river of the Great Tao, it didn't take long for him to arrive at a place that could only be reached by the creation spirit. Since he was here, he couldn't go any further. Otherwise, he would definitely get lost here and be unable to return. He stood beside the long river of the Great Tao and looked in with a scrutinizing gaze. Usually, when great virtues came here, they would cast their imprints. The creation spirit was born naturally and didn't have a ruler of emotions, but its Tao would still be reflected here. However, normally, in order to observe the Tao of others in the long river of the Great Tao, one's own level had to be at least the same as the person being observed. It would be best if one's level was higher. Otherwise, Even if one really saw it, one would only sink into it. If he hadn't defeated the creation spirit and personally sent the Weili into the eternal silence, which improved his Tao a little, it wouldn't have been so easy for him to reach this place. He observed with rapt attention and found his target. As he cast his gaze over, in that instant, he seemed to have shattered a barrier that bound his consciousness. He went to an extremely high and indistinct upper level, where he could see countless of himself fighting with countless spirits of creation. In some battles, he lost, and in some battles, he won. The results of victory and defeat were like bubbles in the water, constantly appearing. After seeing this, although he couldn't fully understand the mysteries of the creation spirit's Tao, he could roughly understand it. He thought to himself, I see. The fundamental Taoist technique of the spirit of creation had indeed been used a long time ago. The reason why he hadn't seen it use it was because it had already used this Taoist technique the moment it was bestowed with spirituality by the great virtues and appeared from the spirit of creation. If there was a name for this Tao, it could be called infinite Tao transformation. If there were two people fighting, then if this could be repeated, there would be 10,000 possibilities in 10,000 battles. Here, the cause was the same, but the result might not be the same. The profundity of this Tao art was that it was able to oppose countless causes and effects, countless possibilities and impossibilities, and create such a situation. This opposition was not something that could be compared to the current world, nor was it an illusion, but a change that relied on the great Tao. However, even though countless battles evolved, each battle was separated. The victory and defeat of one battle would not affect other battles at all. Only the Tao that enveloped everything was the same. If he hadn't come to the long river of the great Tao to see this, he wouldn't have known that he was in this Tao. He pondered for a moment. Logically speaking, there was only one possibility to defeat the spirit of creation under this kind of Tao technique, and that was for their side to be the one to kill the other in every battle. As long as they failed to do so in even one battle, the spirit of creation would not truly perish. It would continue to exist by relying on the Tao technique and become an obstacle for them to reach the great Tao. Not just them, as long as there was no real winner, even the creation spirit itself couldn't transcend, unless he could defeat all three of them at the same time. After understanding this, there was no need for him to stay here any longer. He waved his sleeves and swung his fist. As the void shattered, he walked out of the long river of the great Tao. Just now, when the two ancestors saw him suddenly disappear and then walk out of the void, they could guess where he went. However, they couldn't come and go as freely as he did in the long river of the great Tao. Ancestor Yao Han asked, "Fellow Taoist, did you gain anything?" Zhang Yan nodded. "A little." The great Tao couldn't be explained with words, so he immediately transmitted what he saw to the two ancestors' divine wills. Although the two ancestors' Tao wasn't as profound as his, after receiving the divine wills, it wasn't hard for them to understand the general idea of the creation spirit's Tao. Ancestor Yao Han thought for a moment, then said, "If that's the case, we have indeed exterminated the creation spirit here?" Zhang Yan nodded and said, "What you said isn't wrong. But you must know that this was formed from the transformation of the Tao art of the spirit of creation. If we tacitly approve of his Tao art enveloping above us and stop pursuing the grand Tao, then that person will never appear again. Because to us, that person has already been driven into eternal silence." Ancestor Hongho said solemnly, "But if that's the case, the great Tao isn't complete." Zhang Yan said, "That's right. Because all of this is driven by his Tao. If I don't pursue the supreme Tao, then the great Tao will forever be missing a piece in front of us, and it will never be completed." Ancestor Yao Han said, "Fellow Taoist, do you have a way to solve this?" Ancestor Hongho also looked over. They were people who pursued the Tao, and pursuing the great Tao was their highest goal. If they only sought permanence, why would they need to create the creation spirit? Therefore, they never thought of stopping here. Moreover, according to this development, it seemed like no one could win, but this was the creation spirit's Tao, and it was obvious that it was beneficial to the other party. Therefore, they couldn't just sit around and wait, they had to think of a way to break out of this predicament. Zhang Yan also thought so. Only by truly defeating the creation spirit and completing the Tao would he be able to transcend the great Tao. He wouldn't be satisfied just because of this. He said, "Now there's only one way. Since he's manipulating the Tao, then we'll compete with him in Tao." Ancestor Yao Han said solemnly, "But will fellow Taoists' method really succeed?" There was a reason why he asked this question. Just as Zhang Yan had said, since they had won and lost in the countless battles, there was no need to say anything about the losers, and the winners would surely seek the final answer just like them. However, the great Tao didn't appear in the end, so it was likely that those who had comprehended it had not succeeded in jumping out of this Tao. Zhang Yan smiled. "I know what fellow Taoist is worried about. According to my calculations, there are two possibilities. First, even if one party obtains the Tao because it is to see the karmic effect, we are not in the karmic effect, so we will never see the karmic effect." Hearing this, the two ancestral masters immediately understood what he meant and nodded subconsciously. Actually, this meant that even if one side was able to transcend to the end and come into contact with the Grand Tao in the end, it was only the accomplishments of that side, and it was equivalent to something that had never happened to them. Because without this cause, it would naturally be difficult for them to see effect. They would only be trapped in the state of never coming into contact with the cause and effect, and they would never be able to break through this barrier. Ancestor Hongbo said, "Then what about the other possibility that fellow Taoist is talking about?" Zhang Yan said, "Aside from us, there's also a trace of heaven's will that decides victory and defeat. Even if we use the same method, there will be different results. If we don't try, how can we know if it's useless?" The two ancestors nodded. This was reasonable. Since they refused to give up on pursuing the great Tao, then they had to try no matter what. Zhang Yan said seriously, "The method I used can't take care of everyone, so be careful." Seeing how serious he was, the two ancestors nodded solemnly and said, "Fellow Taoist, just do it." As long as they could fight against the spirit of creation and defeat it, it would be worth it even if they were dragged into it. Zhang Yan's body sank, and his eyes suddenly became a lot darker. The 5 lights behind him flickered, and countless Tao techniques manifested. At the same time, the divine Lord of Dew, who had the body of a turtle and a snake, appeared under his feet. The black and white gas reflected in the air and swayed into it. Suddenly, they combined and turned into one. You're tuning in to the Passion Pages YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.